Chapter 810. That was what the Yomians thought as well. Seeing that the armed forces of the Trade Wind Chamber of Commerce, who wanted to attack the ship, stopped temporarily after being stopped by the dwarf merchants. All the pirates of Yomians who were prepared for battle were shocked. The captain must have hidden some trump card. A sailor with a matchlock gun whispered to his companion beside him. Just like when we played cards with him in the past, the person sitting opposite him never won. Many people who heard this all laughed out loud. They all knew what happened to the sailor with a matchlock gun before the ship sailed to West Sea Town. At the card table, he lost a week's worth of salary to Naaman. "Shut up, you pig head." The first mate walked over with a spike club with a strap and knocked on the iron helmet on the sailor's head, making a clanging sound. "If you want to live, you have to listen to the captain. Do you understand?" The Yomian sailors couldn't refute this teaching of physics. Ever since they joined Naaman's gang a few years ago, not only did their income double a few times, but the number of people who died in each transaction was also a fraction of the previous one. "Hey, my first mate, don't bother with that little bastard who has no money to play cards anymore." Naaman slipped down from the watchtower on the main mast, picked up the big axe on the deck, and carried it on his shoulder. "Do you know how to write? Find a pen and paper." The first mate nodded hurriedly and ran into the captain's cabin behind the deck. The structure of this ship that traveled to and from Dwarf Island was slightly different from their original ship, but as the first mate, he still knew where to find the things the captain requested. Soon, he ran back to the deck with a stack of parchment paper, a bottle of light purple ink, and 2 reed pens. Looking at the tear marks on the parchment paper, Naaman shook his head with a chuckle. "What a wastrel," he scolded with a smile. "These papers were all torn from the dwarf captain's logbook, right? The high-end logbook bound by the dwarves. If it was intact, I could sell one in King's Landing City and get you a year's worth of salary." The first mate was startled for a moment, but soon after, he let out a simple and honest laugh. "I didn't know that it was so expensive, but the dwarf we threw into the sea had already written a lot of pages. I don't think that logbook is worth that much anymore." Naaman ignored him. This guy wasn't interested in sharing his knowledge with ordinary people. He wouldn't tell the first mate that the dwarf's logbook, if it was written by the dwarf captain himself, could be sold at a price that was several times more expensive than a blank logbook. "I'll speak. You write literate." Naaman waved his hand and asked the first mate to find a wooden barrel as a writing desk. He had the bloodline of contract magic. In fact, he could write all the languages in the multiverse. However, the standard writing habits that he had developed in his long life made it impossible for him to write like a pirate of Jorms. The shape was like an earthworm, and the shape was like a dog. Therefore, in order to maintain his persona, Naaman could only pretend that he did not know how to write and let the first assistant, who had a rough understanding of literature, write for him. "I'm angry, very angry. Did we evade taxes, or did we shit and piss in your pot? Why did you ambush us when we just woke up? You're so unreasonable, so immoral. You guys stink worse than pickled herring. At least herring smells bad, but it tastes good. You guys stink to the bone. We just helped the dwarves do a big job. They borrowed something from King's Landing City and wanted us to help transport out. Now the Truant Merchant Guild is helping them to silence them. I'm going to expose this scandal and make you guys pay the price." After Naaman finished speaking, the chief mate quickly finished writing the last word. He grabbed a handful of fine sand and dried the ink on the paper. Then he presented the paper to Naaman. Naaman nodded. "Not bad. Maybe someone will treat your handwriting as a treasure and call it an ugly book. But you have more work to do. You'll have to copy it a few more times." After that, he left the confused first mate on the deck and led the 2 men to the cargo hold of the ship. The special paper and ink that Oak Fist and Ablenstadt stole from King's Landing City were all stored there. He took out half of the things and placed them in front of the stunned first mate. "Let's begin, Culture Man. Heaven take pity on him." And if it had not been for the captain's long accumulated authority, the mate would certainly have quit. Narmit, staring at him as if he were a prisoner, copied the declaration over and over again on the uncut sheets of special paper with a reed pen and a special ink. Every time he finished writing, Naaman would order someone to roll it up and attach a piece of King's Landing City banknote that he took out of his own pocket. He used a string tied with pebbles to make a strong paper tube. Then he swung his arm and threw the tubes to the other ships on the dock. By the time his money bag was empty, the first mate had already copied over 50 declarations. His arms were so tired that they were trembling. Nauman picked up the last paper tube and threw it at the armed forces of the True Wind Chamber of Commerce. The paper tube landed at the feet of a storm attendant. They had already tried their best to retrieve dozens of these things. He had already read the contents, so he summoned a ball of fire without thinking and burned the paper tube on the ground to ashes. The paper tubes from before had already been sent back to the True Wind Chamber of Commerce's headquarters for the master to review. In the audience room of the True Wind Chamber of Commerce, it was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Sangar held an open paper tube and looked at the contents written on it. His heart felt like it had fallen into a hole of ice. "You're looking for your own death." He gritted his teeth and said. The young man's face had already become ferocious. "You actually want to drag the True Wind Chamber of Commerce down with you? What do you take me for? Son of a bitch midget." He roared, without any of his previous bearing. His words also became extremely rude. "Answer my question. Otherwise, don't even think about leaving this audience room." It wasn't his fault. He didn't care about the contents of the declaration at all. Even if he was cursed it a few times, he wouldn't lose anything. But the contents were written with special ink on special paper. Even if there was no real banknote attached, anyone who had used the legal currency of King's Landing City would be able to tell at a glance that there was something wrong with the paper and ink. This was simply making the matter clear. Although the armed forces quickly moved out and retrieved most of the paper tubes, there were still some that were missing. Moreover, even if they retrieved all of the paper tubes, this action alone was enough to cause a heated discussion. Perhaps, before today's counting day was over, the news of the stolen coin-making materials appearing in West Sea Town would spread to the scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce. No, this was almost certain. Sangar almost went crazy. It was true that the merchants docked at the port had some benefits with the True Wind Chamber of Commerce, but in comparison, they definitely wanted to curry favor with the scale of Perpetual Order more. Seeing the ferocious eyes of the Xian Feng Chamber of Commerce's family head, Ablenstadt's expression also became serious. He hesitated for a moment before continuing, "You can use your sword against us, but can't you do the same to others?" Chapter 811. Do you know what you were talking about? Sangar gritted his teeth, but Ablenstadt, who stood in front of him, ignored the ferocious expression of the head of House of Messengers. The dwarf investigator nodded and calmly said, "Of course, I never talk nonsense. You advised me to intervene in a murder. Isn't that nonsense? Not to mention the target of the murder." Sangar paused. Because of the uneasiness in his heart, he just bit his tongue. "Is all the merchant friends who came to attend the Inventory Day celebration?" "I'm just offering a suggestion," Ablins denied. "It's just a suggestion that is the most rational and feasible. As for the target of the murder, I don't have the right to choose. It's all up to you." Hearing this, Sangar took a deep breath. He turned his head and walked to the balcony of the audience room. He slammed the closed door open and didn't even care about destroying the bolt on the door. The young head of the house walked to the balcony and overlooked the entire Shihai town from the towering castle. His eyes locked onto the pier by the sea. Because of the distance, the place in his eyes was like a wet leaf stuck to the periphery of the town. Murder, arson. Sangar's face twitched unnaturally, and Ablenstadt also walked to the balcony. All the sins can't be borne by the messengers alone. You have to do something. Dwarf Island didn't just send a few merchants to Shihai Town. "A very smart suggestion," the dwarf investigator replied after a few breaths. "But we have to move the remaining cargo out of the ship first. Although the Pirate of Joms destroyed some of it, I brought more than that." The cold night indicated that winter was coming. Therefore, after a morning of fighting and an afternoon of torment, Nauman let the first mate and the Joms crew distribute the winter clothing they found on the dwarf ship. Nauman himself wore a long and thick coat over his shirt and pants. The buttons on the front and collar of the coat were tightly fastened, and the back and sides were long. It hung down to his ankles and danced around his waist like a cloak. Perhaps I should also wear a half-body plate armor. Looking at his own attire, Naman couldn't help but think. He didn't like this kind of skirt-like attire. But in the end, he gave up on this idea. We are at war now. This is not the time to think about fashion or tradition. The warmongers under Sarkis's command wear uniforms so that their subordinates can recognize them easily. Accordingly, Naaman sat in a grand manner under the main mast of the top deck and had a lighted wind light with blubber candles hung over his head. In front of him was a small dining table, waiting for the crew to serve him food. Thanks to the advanced cooking utensils on the dwarf ship, their food tonight could be changed to many new dishes. The Jom's crew member who was originally the cook figured out the use of the new cooking utensils and specially made steamed stall potato with bacon stew for his companions. Stall potato was a kind of earth-colored tuber that grew in shallow ponds. After it was fully steamed, the stall potato would be swelled by the water, and then it would be poured with thick and spicy brown bacon stew. This seemingly random combination actually had a different flavor. "You are a fucking genius," Naaman praised the cook who was serving him a plate of freshly cooked stall potato. The cook bowed to the captain to show his respect, then turned around and left to serve the other Jom's crew members. The first mate walked over. "Captain," he lowered his voice, indicating that he wanted to have a more private conversation. "We have held on for long enough today. Although the food on this ship is sufficient, we can't fight against the entire trade wind family in West Sea Town without manpower, weapons, and ammunition. Shouldn't we?" "Do you know?" Naaman knew what the first mate was thinking, but he used a topic that the other party had never thought of to interrupt him. Every war has money behind it. The other factors are just excuses or reasons. What's the difference between the two? The first mate's train of thought was immediately diverted. The communication skills of a contract demon from the 9 prisons of Bader, not to mention that Naaman was a graduate of Nessus Academy. How could a mere mortal guard against him? Of course there is. What they say before is an excuse, and what they say after is a reason. The Trade Wind Chamber of Commerce was worried that we would damage the reputation of West Sea Town's safe harbor, so they attacked us. This is an excuse. And when I told the merchant ships about what they did with the dwarves, I gave them a reason to kill everyone who knows. Hearing Naaman's explanation, the first mate was so shocked that his jaw almost dropped. They would really do that? They would kill everyone on the merchant ships docked at West Sea Town's harbor. The Trade Wind Chamber of Commerce would go crazy. They would be crazy if they didn't do that, Naaman said calmly. So, at the beginning, they only had to deal with 20 people, but now they want to eliminate hundreds of warriors who have been living on the sea for a long time. You know, according to the rules of boarding battle, once you board the deck of the enemy ship, there is no possibility of a draw. In the end, one side will win completely and the other side will lose completely. Looking at the first mate who was still confused, Naaman explained patiently, which was rare. So, don't say that we don't have enough manpower, weapons, and ammo. At the very least, we still have hundreds of allies and a dozen galleons to squander before those ships are all burned to the ground. Of course, the premise is that the Trade Wind Chamber of Commerce attacks quickly. After sending away the first mate who was deep in thought, Naaman continued to eat his dinner. He put the dinner plate on the table, and soon the Jom's crew member who was responsible for cooking ran over, changed the utensils for the captain, and removed the low table that was used as a dining table. The cold night wind blew. Many of the crew members who also finished their dinner and stayed on the deck had goosebumps. Tonight, West Sea Town should be brightly lit, singing and dancing everywhere, and people gathered together to celebrate the year's harvest. But now, looking from the deck, West Sea Town in the distance was like a dormant beast, completely hidden in the darkness of the night. The sea had already begun to rise and kept surging to the shore, slapping against the merchant ships docked at the berth. Accompanied by the sound of flowing water and wooden boards, some people with sharp eyes saw a large group of figures appear at the entrance of the harbor. The captain is right, standing on the stern. The first mate saw this scene clearly. This is probably all of the Trade Wind Chamber of Commerce's armed forces. There are 5 to 6 times more people than the ones who attacked the ship this morning. It's impossible that they are only here to take down 20 people. Chapter 8:12. That tree can talk. A soldier of the Chamber of Commerce stuttered. His fearful expression caused some of his colleagues around him to sneer. Usually, they would disdainfully call these guys who talk crazy before going to the battlefield new recruits. However, this sense of superiority didn't last long. This was because they had also seen it. No, it should be said that they had heard similar words. Haha, the fools are still worried about who should go first. The palm trees outside the port swayed with the wind, and the leaves rustled as they whispered intermittent words. Fortunately, the fear was quickly eliminated. When a midget walked over and casually kicked an iron barrel at the side of the pier, a cry of pain was heard from the barrel. A dwarf poked his head out of the barrel and looked at his compatriot alertly. "Take care of yourself," Ablenstadt snorted. "If you don't waste your illusion on making fun of people, you might be able to end this boring game faster." Faced with the dwarf investigator's questioning, the illusionist showed a trace of embarrassment. Soon, under the dumbfounded gaze of the armed forces of the Chamber of Commerce, more than a dozen dwarves appeared from all corners of the port, in wooden boxes, in piles of abandoned ropes, and under the waves of floating reeds. If you want to continue to go to Stim's game hut to clear the game, then you'll have to work hard. Ablenstadt stretched out his long finger and pointed at the ship anchored at the port. "I don't want to spend the whole night here." The illusionists all nodded in agreement. The dwarf investigator then walked to Sangar. The master of the Chamber of Commerce just took over the management of the armed forces not long ago. He was waiting for news at the moment. Once the family's patrol battleships blocked all the routes to the open sea from the port of West Sea Town, Sangar would give the order to attack. He didn't want to and couldn't leak any information about this battle. In order to cover up tonight's battle, he even sent a few merchant ships that specialized in transporting alchemy raw materials for Dwarf Island to find an excuse for the fire that was about to ignite in the port tonight. The arrow on the bowstring had to be released. Because Sangar and his Truin Chamber of Commerce couldn't afford the revenge of the scales of eternal order, he had no way out. He could only choose to go all out and destroy all possible evidence. Damn dwarves. Hearing his subordinates report, Sangar knew that the dwarven illusionist had almost caused him trouble again. He could not help but seethe with rage. Only when Ablenstadt arrived in front of him did he stop cursing and suppress his anger. "We can launch an all-out attack at any time." The midget investigator had just contacted the lightning monk. Oak Fist had been buffing himself with the underwater breathing magic for a long time, and was now lurking under the dwarf merchant ship. As soon as the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce began to attack the ship, he would forcibly break open the hull and take away the rest of the developing ink and special paper. After that, no matter how the pirates of Joms, the crew of the merchant ships, and the owners of the merchant ships fought with the armed forces of the Reliance Wind Merchant Guild, he would have nothing to do with them anymore. Oak Fist took a small submarine provided by the dwarves and left the West Sea Town pier in the chaos. They followed the planned route all the way to Dwarf Island and safely transported the rest of the goods back. Moreover, his existence was also a secret to Sangar. Afterwards, the president of the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce would only think that the dangerous goods that might cause the scales of Eternal Order's revenge had all been burned. Let the illusionists use some tricks first. Sangar thought for a moment, then said to Ablenstadt, "We can launch an attack on all the ships, but we don't have enough manpower. So before the owners and crew of the merchant ships get hurt, we must make them think that we only launched an attack on the pirates." A very cunning idea. The midget investigator nodded, then took out a small cup-shaped metal object from his arms and whispered a few words into it. Because he used the midget dialect, Sangar didn't understand what he said. The illusionist will create a mist. After a few dozen seconds, the mist formed by magic will dissipate on its own. Any human that inhales the mist during this time will think that the mist hasn't dissipated in the next half an hourglass. Half an hourglass is enough. Sangar waved his hand and signaled the midget investigator to immediately order his compatriots. "With our military strength, even if we don't clean up the entire harbor, we will only leave 2 or 3 people behind. I believe in the strength of your Chamber of Commerce." About a sixth of an hourglass later, the harbor of West Sea Town suddenly had clouds of mist rising for no reason. Because it was nighttime, the wind blew from the land to the sea, so the thick mist quickly drowned the ships docked in the berth. Numun, who was sitting on a wooden barrel with his legs crossed and his hands crossed, couldn't help but smile when he saw this. After waiting for a long time, the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce finally began to move, and it was a midget style. "Chief Officer," Numun yelled at the top of his voice, "is the seasoning I want ready? It's time to add the seasoning." The chief officer, who was standing at the back of the deck and working with two other Jom's crew members around a wooden barrel, heard the captain's call and quickly responded, "It'll be ready soon." Then he immediately pulled out the wooden stick that was used to stir the solution in the wooden barrel and threw it over the side of the ship. The other two Jom's crew members also copied his action and threw away the other two sticks. They worked together to lift the wooden barrel to the side of the ship and poured the scarlet, bubbling solution into the sea along the side of the ship. The solution was originally just some meat soup, but Numun added some flavor-enhancing seasoning that he got from the Ogre Gourmet Blue. Although the amount of seasoning was not much, its effect was amazing. It did not smell like anything, but when it tasted, one could feel the strong smell of blood. The thick meat soup that Numun asked the chief officer and the sailors to stir was filled with the seasoning that Blue would need to cook for a month. According to his speculation, all the sharks that swam within a few dozen kilometers of West Sea Town would be attracted by this barrel of meat soup. In other words, in the next period of time, anyone who tried to attack Numun with a boat or a duck would have a close encounter with a group of sharks. Chapter 8:13. The thick fog dissipated and the battle began. "They're throwing spears. Hide!" Numun, who was sitting on the barrel, quickly bowed and rushed to the bow of the ship. The main mast couldn't provide him with excellent cover, but the towering bow of the ship could. A bunch of javelins landed on the deck. Most of them were sharpened wooden sticks, so there were no casualties. Numun shouted, "Prepare for battle." Then he quickly poked his head out from the side of the ship and looked at the small sampan that was rapidly approaching the ship. The front of the small sampan was equipped with spear-like accessories, so that it could be used to nail the hull of a large ship in a naval battle and make it easier for people to climb up the side of the ship. Numun stepped on the edge of the ship and jumped onto a sampan. The small sampan was so jolted by his steps that it was as if it was going to throw the people on it into the water. He lowered his head and barely dodged an axe above his head. Then he turned around and stabbed the attacker with his sword. Because he had already considered that he would take the lead in a springboard battle, Numun didn't bring a giant axe. Instead, he brought a swift sword and an iron hook that was specially used to organize the rigging. He crossed his legs and made an open space on the slanted deck. Then he stood firmly and stabbed the enemy with his sword in his right hand. At the same time, he used the iron hook in his left hand to grab the enemy's weapon, as long as he locked the weapon, and then when he pulled hard, he would use the swift sword to stab the enemy's neck. He had already seen clearly that in the armed forces of the Chamber of Commerce, except for a few small team commanders, most of the soldiers weren't equipped with armor to protect their throat. A man with a shaggy face opened his bloody mouth and roared as he pounced at him. The opponent's battle axe flew up and down. Numun could only shrink his body and try to avoid this heavy chop. The axe brushed past him and chopped into the side of the ship beside him, cutting off a large piece of wood. Numun thrust his swift sword diagonally. Although he didn't stab the opponent, the sword slapped the man's wrist. The sound was like a stone cracking. The man staggered. Numun took the opportunity to step forward and hit the man's chest with his shoulder, throwing him out of the ship. Not long after, the sampan changed hands. Numun ignored the armed forces that were crawling towards the dwarf ship behind him. Instead, he made a hand gesture with 3 of his fingers, summoning water to push the small sampan towards a large ship nearby. As expected, the merchant ship was also engaged in a close combat battle. The ship's owner was commanding the crew to fight against the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce's soldiers who were constantly climbing onto the ship. No matter how loudly the ship owner shouted, declaring that he was an honest merchant who had nothing to do with the pirates of Joms, the warriors of the Tradewind Merchant Guild paid him no heed. Although he was sneering in his heart, Nam Min's underling was not careless. He quickly climbed the rope ladder on the side of the ship and jumped onto the deck. He quietly circled to the back of the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce's soldiers, who were blocking the entrance to the poop, and mercilessly launched a surprise attack from behind. Before assigning the mission to attack the ships, the XIN Foam Chamber of Commerce had clearly investigated and analyzed every ship anchored in West Sea Town. They had estimated the resistance strength of each ship and used that as a basis to arrange how many people to send to each ship. The captain and crew of this ship only had a dozen people, so the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce only sent 20 or so soldiers. Originally, with the combat training they had cultivated over a long period of time and good equipment, using 20 or so soldiers to wipe out the strength of this ship, even if it took a lot of effort, it would not be considered a heavy loss and the mission would not fail. However, this delicate plan was completely overturned when Naman boarded the ship. Even if the contract demons in the 9 prisons of Bader were not brave and good at fighting, it still depended on who they were compared to. Soon, with Naman's help, the 20 or so soldiers of the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce were completely wiped out by the ship's captain and the sailors. The ship owner sat down on the deck. He was hit in the face, and one of his eyes was almost blinded. The other crew members sat around him, their limbs all weak. "You are the pirate leader of Joms on that ship? I saw your appearance during the day. Tell me, why did you come on a ship to save us?" Although he was heavily injured and exhausted, the ship owner's mind was still very clear. Naman took out something that looked like a wine bag from his bosom. "White medicine from King's Landing City. It's a high-grade product that can only be found in the medical camp." He threw the leather bag over. The captain caught it and poured out a small amount of white powder from the bag onto the wound on his face. In an instant, the blood that was originally gushing out stopped gushing out. A pleasant chill came from the wound. The captain poured out some more powder and distributed it to the injured crew members. Then, he returned the bag of medicine to Naman. "What you said in the afternoon was true. Absolutely true. You bastard." The captain immediately reacted. He wanted to understand why the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce would attack his ship. "Why did you drag us down with you? Also, who the hell sent you here?" With a smile, Naman didn't say much. He only said, "If you want to live, then listen to me." He didn't pay attention to the captain, who was glaring at him. He walked to the side of the ship. "Nail another half an hourglass here. If someone comes to attack, then you can hold on. If you can't hold on, then you'll die. After half an hourglass, raise the sails, raise the anchor, and move closer to our ship. But don't think about rushing out of the berth on the dock and directly escaping the port of West Sea Town." Before he jumped off the ship, he looked back at the captain. "If you want to escape now, you can try, but I estimate that the possibility of you surviving is very small. Your ship will be dismembered into pieces by the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce's battleships." After saying the last sentence, he jumped off the edge of the ship and returned to the small sampan he stole. Under the effect of magic, the sampan seemed to be floating, but it was actually moving very quickly. It sailed towards the other merchant ships docked at the port of West Sea Town. As early as yesterday, when they entered the port, Naman already had a plan. He had a general impression of the merchant ships docked at the port. If the ship's crew was strong, or if the ship's displacement was large, then he would take the initiative to save that ship. As for the other ships, Naman wasn't a creature of the good camp, so why would he care about their lives? After half an hourglass, at least half of the merchant ships docked at the port of West Sea Town had been massacred by the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce. When Naman returned to the dwarf merchant ship that the pirates of Jorms had taken over, at least a dozen of the crew members that he had just eaten dinner with had been injured. There were only 7 or 8 people left who could continue fighting. Naman picked up a shield with his foot and placed it over the dying mate who lay on the edge of the deck. Then he turned into a wild beast and slaughtered all the warriors of the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce on the deck. "Raise the sails and raise the anchor." After the massacre, he searched through the pile of corpses on the deck for a long time before he found the trumpeter. He took down the horn hanging on his body and blew it with all his might. Under the shocked gazes of the remaining Jorm's crew members, the dwarf merchant ship moved without wind and slowly sailed out of the berth. Chapter 8:14. Oak Fist was about to go crazy. Damn it, when did the ships made by Dwarf Island become so sturdy and durable. The lightning monk had already tried stabbing with his iron sword in 2 or 3 divine spells, but he still couldn't make a hole in the bottom of the ship. Also, a large number of sharks appeared at the dock of West Seatown. Because Oak Fist was hiding under the water, he became the target of the vicious sea creatures. He had to divert some of his energy to deal with them. When the ship's anchor rose from the mud and the ship began to slowly move out of the berth, Oak Fist was still unable to complete his goal, to sneak into the cargo hold from the bottom deck and steal the remaining developing ink and special paper. Damn it! The lightning monk poked his head out of the water and threw a punch at a shark that was trying to sneak attack him from behind. He hit the poor guy's nose. In pain, the shark quickly fled. He cast a water walk divine spell on himself and quickly ran to the shore. Ablinstadt, who had been waiting at the dock, saw Oak Fist and quickly stopped the warriors that were about to attack him. Did you get it? Attack that ship. Hurry. The lightning monk jumped out of the water and onto the dock. He immediately said to the dwarf investigator, "There seems to be something wrong with that ship. We can't let them leave West Seatown." However, things had changed faster than they had imagined. As Naaman and the pirate ship left the dock, the merchant ships that were originally docked and fighting with the merchant guild also raised their sails. Even though the storm attendants of the Chamber of Commerce were doing their best to control the direction of the wind, many of the ship owners had arranged for their oarsmen to row with all their might. The merchant ships still slowly but firmly sailed out of the dock and began to gather towards Naaman's ship. At this time, Sangar also came to the dock to supervise the battle. The young patriarch of the merchant guild grabbed a consultant next to him. "Where are the family's warships? Why are they only using small boats to attack?" The consultant quickly explained, "The warship's draft is too deep. They can't enter the port, so they're guarding the main route outside the port. As for the family's merchant ships, they were all sent to King's Landing City a while ago. There was an accident at the slaughterhouse, and they were all temporarily detained by the scale of perpetual order. They are not allowed to return without permission." Seeing the ferocious glint in Sangar's eyes, the consultant could only continue. "Patriarch, please don't worry. Even if those merchant ships leave their berths and sail out of the port, the warships lying in ambush outside the port will tear them to pieces." However, the development of the situation seemed to be aimed at slapping the consultant in the face. Those merchant ships did indeed sail away from the dock, but they did not rush out of the port. With the gnome ship hijacked by the Joms pirates as the center, they actually gathered in a cluster a few hundred yards away from the shore. Through the binoculars, he could see that the sailors on the ship were all busy. The sailors went up and down and brought all the boats close together against the sides and strung them together with ropes through the oars. The sides of the ships were high and low, and between the different levels of the sides, the seamen had laid boards or nailed nets of rope to repair the masts. In this way, the merchant ships of Hedgehog Market became a fortress, and everyone could free up their hands to fight. Looking at the consultant who had just promised him, Sangar's face darkened. His gaze was as ferocious as a hungry wolf. "You," he pointed with his finger, "take the lead in the small sampan and continue to attack those bastards." Then he looked at the gnome investigator next to him, as well as the bald, lightning monk standing next to him. He was the closest person to the Ramsay of Gnome Island. The patriarch of House of Faith had a rare expression of anxiety on his face. "You still have 2 merchant ships." Before launching a full-scale attack, Sangar had agreed to the gnome's request and allowed their 2 merchant ships to sail out of the port ahead of time. They were now pacing back and forth outside the port. Their original plan was to wait until they finished silencing the gnomes, then return to the port to load their goods, and immediately sail to Gnome Island. But now, on the port of Shihai Town, other than the merchant ships that had escaped, all the other merchant ships had been destroyed. Many of the ships were even stranded in their berths. In other words, if the Chamber of Commerce wanted to continue attacking the merchant ships that had formed a fortress on the sea, they could only take the small sampan. However, Sangar had just learned from a messenger that a large number of sharks had appeared at the port of Shihai Town. It was probably because too many corpses had fallen into the sea, and the smell of blood had attracted all of them. If they took the small sampan to attack, not only would they be naturally restrained when fighting against the large ships with towering sides, it would also be very dangerous just to sail a few hundred yards. You must let those 2 merchant ships come back and carry my soldiers. Sangar's eyes were burning, and his voice was as shrill as an owl's. We have suffered a great loss in this battle. Not only did we lose the reputation of the Chamber of Commerce, but we also lost a port. He was not exaggerating when he said this. As everyone knew, sharks were creatures with good memories. After this battle, the area around Shihai Town would be especially favored by sharks for a long time. Naturally, there was a great risk for ships docking here. But you gained the friendship of Nome Island, Ablenstadt replied to the patriarch of the Chamber of Commerce. However, this midget investigator wasn't really unreasonable. He was not stingy with the 2 merchant ships of the same clan. Instead, he immediately contacted them and ordered them to return to the port of Shihai Town as soon as possible. They would carry the soldiers of the Chamber of Commerce to attack the floating fortress on the sea. At night, the entire port of Shihai Town was lit up with bonfires. The Chamber of Commerce took out bales of blubber candles from the warehouse. They threw these precious goods into the bonfire to increase the brightness of the flames and make it easier to fight. The 2 Nome merchant ships were full of soldiers and sailed side by side on the sea. They were separated by a distance of around 20 meters. Many small sampans were using this as a shelter to avoid the sharks while simultaneously attacking from the side. They attacked again and again until the sun rose and the first rays of the morning sun shined on the sea. The floating fortress still didn't fall, although many of the merchant ships that were connected by ropes were slowly sinking. The surviving captains and sailors relied on the wooden planks and ropes placed on the sides of the ships to continuously cross one side of the ship after another. They moved to the side that was not attacked and continued to defend. Chapter 8:15. Naman drank a few mouthfuls of wine, and the wine slammed into his stomach like a fist. After a while, warmth spread throughout his body. He tossed the wine to the first mate who had just undergone surgery and was lying on the deck. Other than the Joms pirates, the other people in this moving fortress made of merchant ships were all-sea merchants and their crew members from all over Ramsey. After a night of fighting, these people had already silently accepted Naman's command. The one sitting next to him was also a captain. He looked around and asked, "How many people do we have left?" Shrugging his shoulders, Naman replied, "About 150 people. About half of them are injured, and about 20 of them are seriously injured. The doctors on the ship have all been gathered and are doing their best to save the injured and perform surgery on them." A Joms pirate sitting across from Naman said, "That Kiongal was sitting comfortably on the shore the entire night. He doesn't care about the people of West Sea Town and is determined to kill us all, even if we might drown first." "No," Naman said, "if you jump into the sea now, you will definitely be bitten to death by sharks before you drown." It was a very cold joke, even colder than what the Joms pirate had said. The atmosphere instantly became very awkward. However, the instigator Naman acted like nothing had happened. He stood up and walked around the deck. Then he leaned against the side of the ship and looked into the distance. The faint morning light shined on the surface of the sea and seemed to coat the entire West Seatown harbor with a layer of orange. Flocks of seagulls and crows wandered on the surface of the sea. They circled around the floating corpses and wanted to pick up some leftovers from the sharks' mouths. At this moment, a dark cloud suddenly appeared on the horizon in the distance. It was as if a large bruise had appeared in the sky. Many people on the floating fortress saw this scene and had goosebumps all over their bodies. The cold wind blew the flag on the ship until it fluttered like long hair. Under the dark cloud, the sky was a misty green that flickered in and out. Whoosh! Naman whistled. "We finally made it in time. These people won't last long." Outside West Sea Town, a fleet was slowly entering the harbor. They were originally arranged in a half-moon formation, but in order to increase the efficiency of entering the port, they temporarily changed into a wedge-shaped formation. Behind them, the Trade Wind family's battleships had all been turned into spare parts. The leading warship had a ferocious dragon head at its bow. It It was in the middle of the formation, slightly more prominent than the other warships. The armor was like a swan's chest, and it was covered with armor that looked like scales. After entering the harbor, the huge dragon ship, the Nefermindis, was partially deformed. Two sets of symmetrical claws extended from the sides of the ship. In a shallow harbor, it began to move forward in a zigzag pattern, half driving and half crawling. As the Nefermindis advanced, the scaled armor on both sides of the ship fell into the water, splashing water everywhere. The ancient brown dragon emperor, who had recovered part of the characteristics of the megalosaurus from the form of the Leviathan battleship, began to summon his guards to open a path for him. A silent deterrence swept through the entire West Sea town's harbor. This was the terrifying dragon aura that belonged to the ancient brown dragon. The people guarding the floating fortress became uneasy, and the trade wind chamber of commerce soldiers who were preparing to launch a new attack on the shore all became fearful. What was even more terrifying was that the sharks that gathered in the West Sea town's harbor were like live fish that fell into a pot of oil. They desperately jumped on the surface of the sea and, at the same time, rushed to the shore where they were most likely to be stranded. I wish you a long life. When the Nefermindis passed by the floating fortress, Numan, who was standing at the side of the ship, greeted it in dragon language. The ancient brown dragon turned its head and glanced at him, then continued to walk to the West Sea town's harbor. Some of the crew members on the floating fortress even stood up to take a look. They found that there was not a single sailor on the leading battleship. Unless Keyes was there, the ancient brown dragon would not allow anyone to board its back. When the hundreds of Pharaoh's blades walked out from the bottom of the sea, the landing battle immediately ended. They walked in an orderly manner past the stranded sharks, and any enemy that stood in their way would be mercilessly killed by them. When the soldiers on the other battleships disembarked, there was not a single enemy standing on the harbor. If the trade wind chamber of commerce soldiers did not kneel and surrender, the Pharaoh's blades would not show any mercy. Without shedding a drop of blood, the fleet of King's Landing City captured the West Sea town's harbor. The head of the trade wind chamber of commerce, Sangar, was currently under the protection of a few storm servants and a team of elite soldiers. He urged his horse to flee to the family's castle. However, when he reached the castle's main gate, the trade wind chamber of commerce's flag on the battlements had already been thrown down. An ogre that was as large as a storm giant was sitting in the castle's doorway. Seeing Sangar and the others run in front of him, Neru opened his bloody mouth and revealed a sinister smile. "I've been waiting for you for a long time. It's best if you don't surrender. I'll get some exercise today." As he spoke, he stood up from the ground and charged at the trade wind chamber of commerce's team with his ebony spikes. The giant weapon, that was even larger than a battering ram, was like an ordinary wooden stick in his hand. He swung it around vigorously. Facing such a vicious weapon, they would die if they were grazed. If they were hit, they would be smashed into paste. The two storm servants next to Sangar summoned a few bolts of lightning. However, even if the mountain-like ogre was struck by the lightning, it was as if nothing had happened. As a natural ogre warlord, Neru had extremely high magic resistance after reaching adulthood. Furthermore, after being targeted by the storm attendants, Neru even took out a revolver that was thousands of times larger than the normal model from his waist. He pulled the trigger and used the bullets that were like small barrels of gunpowder to point at the divine spellcasters. Bang, 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 bang. After pulling the trigger 6 times in a row, 6 shallow pits appeared on the ground. In these shallow pits, there were pieces of flesh that were about to be smashed into foam and a bullet that looked like a lead ball. Even though Sangar's arrow didn't hit him, he was still knocked off his horse by the shockwave from the explosion. One of his legs was pressed down by the horse that fell on the ground, and he could not move at all. Neru swung his ebony spikes and swept across the trade wind chamber of commerce's face. The trade wind chamber of commerce's face was bruised and swollen, as if he had been punched dozens of times in a row. However, he was lucky. Neru had to capture the trade wind chamber of commerce alive, so he was not smashed into pieces by the ebony spikes like his soldiers. Fred and Green, the mayors of Red Pine City and Emerald City, looked at this horrifying scene and could not help but gasp. "My old friend, have you issued your latest administrative order?" Green looked at Fred. "I, and any rational Ramseyan, absolutely do not want to face such an opponent on the battlefield." Chapter 8:16. Winter had arrived, and the first snow had fallen. Because King's Landing City had a naturally unfrozen harbor, trade activities weren't greatly affected. The Devil's Stomach Tavern in the harbor area was still very lively. The door to the tavern suddenly opened, and a group of people walked in. They were all huddled up in their knee-length deerskin coats and looked like travelers from the southern city-states of the Ramsey continent. "This is great." Mr. Gree had just drunk a large cup of beer and was sitting behind the bar. His body leaned crookedly against the wall of the tavern. The firewood in the fire pit crackled. Because there was a special flue under the floor, the tavern was warm and cozy. The merchants were busy toasting each other and discussing all kinds of business information as they toasted each other. "Those dwarves really are crazy." A drinker took a sip of honey wine, which was the most appropriate drink of the season. He burped and then continued to complain to his friends at the same table. They actually dared to steal something from the scale of perpetual order. "Oomph." Another person responded. That person was also a merchant. In the end, it was all over. Even the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce and the Wusong Chamber of Commerce suffered. "I still have a fucking box of goods in the Wusong warehouse that I can't take out right now." Bad luck. Who said it wasn't? What they were talking about was the hottest topic in the Ramsey continent recently. Although it happened in King's Landing City, the entire Ramsey continent was paying attention to it. In particular, the public trial that was about to be held in King's Landing City attracted everyone's attention. Since the establishment of the city-states of the Ramsey continent, this was the first time a city-state had tried a noble, a citizen of Dwarf Island, and the head of a large chamber of commerce. The names of Red Pine City's Aegon, the dwarf investigator Ablenstadt, the dwarf illusionist of Wessy Town, and the head of the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce, Sangar, had already spread throughout the Ramsey continent. Merchants and travelers gathered in King's Landing City. These people were all keenly aware that a fierce storm was about to sweep through the land. However, they also saw an opportunity in the midst of the crisis. When the storm gathered, the eye of the storm was actually the safest place. In King's Landing City was the eye of the storm. After all, the power of the scale of perpetual order was deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts. "Let's order some honey wine," someone suggested as soon as they walked into the tavern and found an empty long table. "The mutton soufflé here is good too." Oakfist was quite familiar with this tavern. The Lightning Monk had visited King's Landing more than once. Every time, he would go to the Demon's Stomach Tavern to solve his stomach problems. He knew how to match good food without being too expensive. "Is this really okay?" A man sitting near the wall frowned and looked at the noisy tavern hall. The Devil's Stomach is where the Breakwater Tavern used to be. When Soft Maple City was still around, this place was famous for the gimmick of no secrets can be kept. "Don't drink too much." Oakfist glanced at his deputy commander. "The best way to hide a drop of water is to drip it into the sea. The best way to hide a grain of sand is to throw it into the sand." Seeing that the commander had made up his mind, the deputy commander did not say anything else. On the day that the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce was destroyed by the army of King's Landing, only Oakfist and his mercenaries escaped from Wessy Town. They traveled for more than 10 days before arriving at King's Landing with the first snowfall of the year. The Lightning Monk had communicated with his god, and Stim had given his will, bring the dwarf investigator Ablenstadt back to Dwarf Island. At the very least, he could not be judged by the human city of Ramsey. This was not to say that the god favored dwarves. In fact, the dwarf god that Ablenstadt believed in was not the god of virtual games, Stim. It was just that Stim had calculated an outcome that was not too ideal through his divine power. If Ablenstadt was allowed to be judged, then his plan to recruit human believers among the humans of Ramsey would be completely ruined. And during this period of time, he obviously could not bear such a blow. More than 10 years ago, when the Holy One descended and participated in the defense of Dwarf Island from the Lord of Reefort, the number of dwarves on Dwarf Island who believed in Stim had greatly increased, whether in terms of the number or the degree of piety. He had also benefited from this. Now he was steadily transforming from a weak divine power to a lesser divine power. Previously, the loss of the power of faith due to participating in the blood war had almost been completely made up for by the gains of this period of time. Stim was even now planning whether he could break through the ceiling of a lesser divine power and become an intermediate divine power in one go. And to realize this idea, under the premise that he did not offend the other dwarf gods, Stim's best choice was to gain new believers among the humans of Ramsey. As early as 10 years ago, he had made arrangements for this, and the lightning monk, Oak Fist, was a priest that the god of virtual games had selected from the humans of Ramsey. Compared to other gods, Stim could be said to be extremely generous to these lightning monks. They did not need to pray day and night like the priests of other gods, and only needed to continuously level up in the game that he had set, and these lightning monks' ability to cast divine spells would be correspondingly improved. However, this also meant that the lightning monks' dependence on Stim had greatly increased. So much so that in their eyes, Stim was even more glorious than the god of virtual games that he represented. They could not refuse the call of their god. For Oak Fist, every order that Stim gave him was not a test of faith, but a source of money needed to spend money in the virtual game world. If he wanted to level up faster and gain a stronger ability to cast divine spells, then he had to act according to Stim's wishes. And the stronger his ability to cast divine spells, the more difficult missions Stim would assign him. It was like a cycle. However, none of the lightning monks, including Oak Fist, knew that the god of virtual games was actually using tricks to continuously obtain new, low-quality saint shells. He firmly believed that quantitative change would eventually bring about qualitative change. One day, he would be able to obtain enough lightning monks and project enough power onto the Ramsey continent, unifying the faith of the most populous race on this plane. And then, he would break through the shackles of an intermediate divine power and stride towards a greater divine power. Therefore, after having a premonition, and a god's premonition was usually not baseless, that Ablandstad's trial would cause his plan to completely collapse, Stim acted decisively. He issued an order to all the lightning monks on the Ramsey continent, especially Oak Fist, who had worked with the dwarf investigator before. Do whatever it takes to let Ablandstad escape trial. Even if he had to disappear from the world before the trial, it was still appropriate. Chapter 817. Oak Fist used a street lamp to check the address, which he had scribbled on a piece of white paper a few hours ago. 178, he muttered to himself, squinting at the house number. The members of the mercenary group followed a few steps away, holding their weapons hidden in their robes and remaining vigilant at all times. Lotz was in the wealthy district of King's Landing, although it was not in King's Landing City. Oak Fist and his men had come all the way from the city by rail. The streets and alleys were lined with small, clean houses. Most of the residents were businessmen and high-ranking technicians. The streetlights were bright, and every street was patrolled regularly by patrols. Oak Fist could not help but wonder if he had come to the wrong place. Not a good place to kill, he thought, but quickly changed his mind. The street ahead was dark, and when he got closer, he found that several streetlights had been extinguished. Perhaps someone had deliberately put them out. He counted the house number and had an idea, so he left the road and went straight to his target. He knocked on the front door 3 times. There was no light in the house, but from the outside, there was no sign of abandonment. The front door opened a crack, and he and the mercenaries immediately went in. The others waited in the living room. Oak Fist was grabbed by the arm and led into the hallway to the back room. A match was lit, and a candle was lit. Above the candlelight was an unfamiliar face. "Nice to see you, Lightning Monk." "Likewise. I hope I'm not late. The other guests are not here yet." "Very well. I would like to hear their plan of action myself." Oak Fist's eyes adjusted to the light. He looked around and found himself in a small kitchen. The floor and cupboards proved it. There was a person sitting on what looked like a countertop. He had a pipe in his mouth, but it was not lit. The person was not tall, of medium height, and had a good posture. He or she, because the person was completely hidden in a hooded robe and had no mustache. Oakfist could not tell if they were a man or a woman. Even if the person had a pipe in his mouth, it was difficult to see the person's face in the dim candlelight. "You are the middleman?" Oakfist asked. "Yes, me and that stupid bird," the person sitting added. Oakfist couldn't figure out the other party's gender, because when he spoke, it was as if a choir had been stuffed into his clothes. The man's head was still lowered as he spoke. The only movement he made was to tidy up his long black coat as a sign of respect for the guest. At the same time, he dusted the front of his coat. As for the guy who was called Stupid Bird, at this time he was focused on sizing up the oak fist. His eyes were slowly moving up and down, judging and weighing. This made the lightning monk feel as if someone was tickling him through his boots. "Damn barber," Oak Fist said angrily. However, he managed his expression well, and the emotions in his heart did not affect his rational judgment. "It's all for the glory of our God." He knew the purpose of his trip, to rescue or kill the midget investigator. This was very difficult, so he needed some special help, and those who could help him were the barbers. Oak Fist didn't know more about the barbers than most of the Monarch Descends members, but that didn't stop him from acknowledging their abilities. It was rumored that when the Monarch's Landing was established and the Order of the Scales of Perpetual Order was followed, the organization Barbers also took root here. They were a group of opportunists hiding in the dark, and their members came from different backgrounds: humans born and raised in Ramsey, visitors from another plane who came to Monarch's Landing through the portal, and even illusionists from Dwarf Island. Barbers was just a codename. They didn't make a living by taking care of the hair and beards of their customers. These people were mainly engaged in the business of spying on the information of their competitors and dealing with enemies that couldn't be dealt with through normal means. Of course, the barbers had their own rules. Never test the tolerance of the scales of perpetual order. However, this rule seemed to be no longer followed. The reason was simple. The leader of the barbers had changed. This was what had happened some time ago. After Oak Fist and the others caused that big incident at the Slaughterhouse Wharf, the senior leaders of the barbers were all reshuffled in less than 2 days. The new barbers picked up their scissors and aprons. The new leader even said, as long as the money is paid, the barbers can make any hairstyle for their customers. In other words, they seemed to have abandoned their old creed and became much bolder. Many people who had once hired barbers guessed that the reason for the bloody change in the barbers was because there were people who were hostile to Monarch's Landing behind the scenes. However, these guesses had nothing to do with Oak Fist. He only knew that when he sent someone to ask if they could assassinate some prisoners who were about to be tried by the scales of perpetual order, the new barbers didn't refuse. They gave him a list of prices. So, when he came to Monarch's Landing and filled his stomach at the Devil's Stomach Tavern, Oak Fist followed his previous agreement and took the last train to Lots to meet with the barbers. Although the barbers had a good reputation, in order to ensure that his plan could be carried out smoothly, he still wanted to hear how they would act. "You want to hear the plan of action?" The barber, codenamed Dumb Bird, curled his lips, as if offended by Oak Fist's request. "This is against the rules. The money will be paid." Oak Fist raised his right hand, in which he was carrying a deerskin travel case. Dumb Bird immediately put on a flattering face. "However, it has always been our mission to serve our customers with all our heart. Since you want to hear the boring details, we will naturally be happy to tell you." As he spoke, he stretched out his 2 palms. Oak Fist put the case on the 2 chicken claw-like palms and turned his hands behind his back. He watched as Dumb Bird couldn't wait to open the case to check the real banknotes inside. The clattering sound of the case only lasted for a few seconds before Dumb Bird closed the case again. The corners of his mouth curled up, and he squeezed out an extremely ugly smile. The barbers are already in a meeting. Dumb Bird took out a wooden beer mug from the cupboard and handed it to Oak Fist in front of him. He then put his palm to his ear. "You can listen to what they are planning." Oak Fist did as he was told. When he picked up the wooden mug, he realized that there was a thin metal wire connected to the bottom of the mug. At the same time, outside the kitchen window, a 2-story building across the street lit up with candlelight. However, it didn't take long for the curtains to be drawn on the windows of the building to prevent malicious eyes from peeking in. "It's them?" Oak Fist listened attentively. The barbers who are going to carry out the mission are all Japanese. Chapter 8:18. The new hotel built by the mayor of Red Pine City was open for business, although he was the only customer. The living room was extremely spacious. The brick walls were ornate, and the granite fireplace was big enough for two bulls to fit in. The butler invited the master of the boundless Chamber of Commerce to take a seat, but Mitaru politely declined. He just walked around slowly, waiting for the owner of the hotel to appear. Perhaps it was his nature as a merchant, but he carefully inspected the floor, walls, and door. By observing the maintenance of the mansion, he could understand the increase or decrease of the wealth of the Ramsey nobles. When there was a shortage of funds, maintenance was often not done in time. The servants would be dismissed, and the supplies would be stretched. But everything here was new. The wooden furniture and brass decorations were shiny, the floor was newly waxed, and the brick walls were free of dust. The owner of this house is not short of money, Mitaru thought to himself. It will be difficult to tempt him with benefits, but it is not entirely impossible. After all, the inheritance of the Truewind Chamber of Commerce is very tempting. Thinking of the wealth, he could not help but gulp. But his rationality told him that he could not be greedy for things that were beyond his means. As a member of the Barbers, Mitaru had gained too much because of his identity. He had transformed from a small clerk in Sakiko to one of the few great merchants in King's Landing. So, he had to contribute to the Barbers. An exchange of equal value, fair and square. Mitaru calmed himself down. He heard movement in the hall and immediately turned to face the door, smoothing out the front of his waistcoat. A group of people entered in a single file. There were 3 men, all of them dressed in the scarlet uniform of Red Pine City's military officers, with golden ribbons slanted across their chests. They were all Red Pine City's aristocrats, and at the same time, Fred's trusted aides who governed the city. Fred, the mayor of Red Pine City, followed behind them. He was dressed in a purple woolen riding suit. Although the room was warm like spring, his collar was still buttoned, and a golden shawl was draped over his shoulders. His boots clicked on the wooden floor. The knights sized up Mitaru, their eyes wary. He recognized these men. There were portraits of them in the hall outside. In the corner of the portraits, there were cursive words describing the meritorious deeds of these men in Red Pine City. I need to take a look at your documents. Sorry to trouble you. There was a young knight, not more than 25 or 26 years old, who, in contrast to his older companions, had not experienced the passage of time. Wearing the officer's uniform of Red Pine City, he looked like a teenager wearing his father's military uniform to play a war game. He walked up to Mitaro and spoke quickly. Mitaru narrowed his eyes at the lord's insolence. It had been a long time since he was treated in such a manner. I showed it to the butler when I came, and the paperwork is complete. Mitaru replied in Ramsey with an accent. That won't do either. Nitaro fumbled for an envelope and handed it to the young knight. He suppressed his anger. The young knight simply ignored him and flipped through his documents. Then he returned to his older colleague and handed them one of the papers. It was a list of trade activities between the Meishu Chamber of Commerce and Red Pine City. It accurately recorded the categories and quantities of goods sent by the Chamber of Commerce to Red Pine City. On the appendix, there was a receipt with Fred's signature and seal. The knights and the mayor of Red Pine City finally confirmed that Mitaru was the person in charge of the Meishu Chamber of Commerce in King's Landing. What makes you think I will meet you? Fred, who had finally checked the list, handed it to a knight standing in front of him. He sat on a velvet-upholstered armchair and looked askance at Mitaru. Especially when I already know that you have a cooperative relationship with the Chamber of Commerce, and that one of my vassals has taken the blame for the unscrupulous conduct of the Chamber of Commerce. Are you here to seek fame? Mitaru's gaze swept across the knights present and finally landed on Fred. He sat in the corner of the parlor, to the left and behind the knights, as if he was only willing to be a bystander. When Mitaru asked him the question directly, he seemed to be taken aback, but immediately controlled his emotions. Fame is worth a lifetime to fight for. Then you must not wish to see Sir Aegon and his employer, Senjul, face each other in court. He emphasized the words sir and employer. In the aristocratic system of the cities of Ramsey, Nobles could only be the vassals of other nobles. This relationship was maintained by factors such as honor, land, people, power, and obligations. However, there was absolutely no salary involved. That was a method used by merchants to win over subordinates. It could not be exchanged for loyalty, and it was not in line with the dignity of nobles. However, based on Aegon's conduct, he was both Fred's vassal and Singel's employee. This placed Singel and Fred in the same position. Mideru's words were tantamount to a slap in the face. The knights present were all livid, and their hands were on the daggers at their waists. Who gave you the courage to speak like this, to humiliate the mayor of a city to his face? Fred jumped to his feet and shouted, I am only stating a fact that not only you, but also some people, including myself, do not wish to see, Mideru said, neither servile nor overbearing. Like you, I do not wish for that brat from the Reliance Wind Merchant Guild to be put on trial. Based on my understanding of that guy, in order to get away with his crimes, he'll reveal too many trade secrets. He paused for a moment before continuing. Trade secrets in our eyes may become earth-shattering scandals in the eyes of Ramsay citizens. It's a stinking scandal. After saying this, he took out a folding knife from his waist that barbers often use to shave customers. This thing is dipped in a special kind of poison. As long as a small cut is made, it can quickly kill a person. Moreover, as soon as blood is seen, the poison on the blade will quickly evaporate, and after a dozen breaths, it will no longer be found. The knights immediately drew their daggers. They shielded Fred behind them and pointed their swords at Mideru. As a noble, Sir Aegon has certain privileges in the prison. He has a cell with a washroom and may need a shaving tool on a daily basis. You only need to bring this razor to him. Of course, his shaving skills may not be very good. When he shaves for his former employer, it is entirely possible that he will cut the man's face. Who are you? Fred pushed aside the knights in front of him and strode towards Mideru. Although the mayor of Red Pine was now old, he was actually a powerful magic swordsman when he was young. He was already holding a shield spell in his hand, ready to activate a force field at any time to block the attack of the Japanese in front of him. Chapter 819. I used to be a hairdresser for a period of time. Mideru smiled and replied to Fred, who was at daggers drawn. The mayor of Red Pine frowned. Then he dismissed the knights so that Mideru could show off his skills and take care of the beard he had deliberately grown for many years. That doesn't completely convince me. Fred looked at the Japanese merchant in front of him. His eyes were like a chef looking at the chicken breast on a chopping board. I've heard of the barber's reputation, but that's not enough for me to participate in a dishonorable act. Mideru nodded. The Chamber of Commerce has lost everything. It's like a broken boat with a leak. Singel is doomed. This means that someone needs to take over his belongings. West Sea Town belongs to Red Pine Town, so I can't interfere. But in King's Landing City and other cities, the Chamber of Commerce still has a huge amount of money in loans and deposits. The barber will give half of that money to our friend. The barber was one of the oldest organizations in King's Landing City. It was said that it could be traced back to Soft Maple City, the ruins of a city covered by King's Landing City. They claim to have a history of 150 to 300 years. Of course, how long this organization had existed depended on who answered and how drunk that person was. Fred knew about this rumor. He didn't respect him, but he certainly wouldn't treat him as a small character. Give me your razor, and then you can leave the Red Pine Inn. He thought for a while and finally decided. Half an hourglass later, Mideru returned to the street. He was wearing a short hunting coat with his sleeves rolled up. His forehead was covered with large beads of sweat. In the Red Pine Inn, Fred's black chin had been shaved clean, and he was using a hot towel. When the Japanese merchant turned 2 streets in his palanquin, another group of people came to visit the Red Pine Inn. The leader was none other than the mayor of Greenwood City, who was on good terms with Fred. Green led the people through the corridors and alleys. The housekeeper in the inn didn't dare to stop them. He went directly to the living room and pressed the password of the mechanical spring lock. He pushed open the leather-wrapped oak door and walked to Fred, who was sitting on the sofa. "You're here?" Fred asked. "It's not just me. You should know. Green stepped aside to reveal the visitor behind him. Mr. Brock is also interested in the barber's movements. They asked me to deliver a brand new set of personal cleaning products to Aegon, and also to deliver a message. Fred removed the towel from his face and stroked his chin. As you expected, they're interested in Sangar. Maybe. Brock lifted his hood. Because he was wearing the spell amplification device on his face, his voice was always dull and suffocating. But this is just a smokescreen. I'm sure they have other intentions. What should I do? Mayor Hong Song sat up straight and looked at the desert elf who was sitting on the sofa opposite him. Brock snapped his fingers, and the surrounding air seemed to explode with a bang sound. Everyone present felt a slight tinnitus. However, the desert elf's voice, which was as soft as a mosquito's, was accurately transmitted into Fred's mind. Just do as they say, I know. Fred sighed. I'll leave Aegon's matter to you. This matter was completely due to the barber bribing one of my servants. Only then was he able to complete the task. It has nothing to do with you, me, or Red Pine City. As he spoke, Mayor Hong Song picked up a silver bell on the coffee table in front of him. With a pleasant tinkling sound, the door of a reception room was opened again. The butler carried a tray with a brand new bone china tea set on it. Freshly brewed pine needle milk tea was in the teapot. This was the best product for the nobles of Red Pine City. The guests sat in the host's seat and began to enjoy the tea. After about an hourglass, they ended their chat. Green took the initiative to get up and leave the Red Pine Hotel with Blatch. At the same time, outside an alley in the westernmost part of King's Landing City, the rhythmic sound of horse hooves could be heard on the gravel road. 2 Japanese jailers guarding the prison gate leaned on their rifles and looked in the direction of the sound. Someone's here to visit again. Seeing a rider galloping over on a maroon horse with an ornament of the Ramsay noble family, one of the jailers said to his companion, "Let's split it 50-50. How about that?" The jailers gave him a subtle gesture, which meant no problem. Not long after, the rider arrived in front of the prison gate and quickly jumped down from the saddle. "I'm a servant of the mayor of Red Pine City." The man untied a leather bag from the saddle. It seemed to be filled with a lot of things. When he untied it, it made a clanking sound. "I'm here to deliver some personal cleaning products to Sir Aegon. Please make an exception." Then, the man shook hands with one of the jailers. Feeling the thickness of the things in his hand, the jailer nodded to his companion. The two of them had a tacit understanding. As for the bag of personal cleaning products, they just casually checked it and wrote a receipt for it. Originally, with the greed of these Japanese prison guards, these personal cleaning products might have been taken advantage of before they were placed here. Just a few months ago, there was a tragedy in this prison. A few ignorant jailers robbed a dangerous person of his belongings. Among those belongings, there was a terrifying item that could move and kill people on its own. Since then, the Japanese jailers have been much more restrained. Now, they only dared to collect banknotes. They did not dare to think about the items that were sent into the prison. After all, no one could say for sure whether or not there would be any strange and deadly things inside. As a knight of Red Pine City, Aegon enjoyed some privileges that ordinary prisoners did not have in the prison. For example, at least half of his cell was above the ground, and he could enjoy the warm sunlight for most of the day. For example, not only was his cell equipped with a mattress, but there was also a separate bathroom for him to use. Today, the mayor of Red Pine sent someone to deliver a package full of personal cleaning products to him. Aegon opened it and took a closer look. It was full of things that he used on a daily basis. Apart from a sharp razor, which he rarely used to shave, Aegon did not know why Fred would send him such a tool. Aegon picked up the razor and frowned. He slowly rubbed the tortoiseshell inlaid handle with his thumb. Chapter 820. Sangar woke up with a start. His clothes were soaked in sweat, his body was hot, and his breathing was labored. He saw the sunlight shining through the window that was enclosed by a grid of thumb-sized cast iron rods. It was already past 10 in the morning. "Master!" A rhythmic knock came from the black oak door of the prison. Hearing the voice, Sinjil knew who was standing at the door. Aegon had been visiting him at this time of the day to chat and play a game of heroes chess. "Come in." Sangar got out of bed, tidied himself up, put on a new set of clothes, and opened the door. Aegon stood leaning against the doorframe, holding a bowl of oatmeal in one hand and a small deerskin bag in the other. He did not bring the checkered chessboard. Behind Aegon, two Husang jailers stood with spears in their hands. Their role was to ensure order in the prison. When dealing with noble prisoners like Aegon and Sangar, they also had to ensure their safety when exercising their limited freedom of movement. "You seem to be sleeping well." Sangar glanced at Aegon. He found that his relative's eyes were full of vitality, and the wrinkles on his face had smoothened out. "At least you're better than me." Aegon put down his breakfast. "The food in King's Landing prison is good." He handed Sangar a silver spoon. "The oatmeal has tender yellow cheese cubes with a bit of nutty sweetness." Sangar shook his head out of habit as he ate his breakfast to dispel the remnants of his sleepiness. His consciousness was hazy, and his thoughts were slow. This meant that he was still not used to the bed in the prison. "I have to ask them to change me into a bed with a cushion and a pillow with a silk cover. Otherwise, I'll die of exhaustion before the public trial," he muttered in his heart. It had been 5 or 6 days since he was imprisoned here, and Aegon had been here about a month earlier than him. Sangar did not know how Aegon got used to this place. "You not playing chess today?" Noticing that the other party didn't bring a chessboard, the head of the Xian Feng Chamber of Commerce asked in surprise. "Could it be that they won't even allow us to enjoy such a small pastime?" Aegon smiled. He opened the deerskin pouch and took out a silver-plated mirror. Before the establishment of King's Landing, when the Ramsey city-states still used gemstone coins, no one would be so extravagant as to use such a large gemstone coin to make toiletries and other personal cleaning products. "You must look forward," Aegon said, stroking his smooth, bruised cheek. Sangar realized that his beard and hair had grown into knots and needed a shave. After finishing the oatmeal porridge in the bowl, Senner walked to a brass basin and opened the pipe that was connected to the outside, allowing the hot water to pour into the basin. He washed his face and wiped his face with the towel twice. Aegon placed the small mirror on the table, pulled out a chair for Sangar, and took out a linen cloth to wrap around his neck. The head of the Xian Feng Chamber of Commerce nodded and sat on the chair. He asked curiously, "Since when did a noble lord become so skilled? Prison life can change people so much." "Forced by life." Aegon sighed and wrapped the linen cloth around Sangar's neck. "Sometimes people have to do things by themselves. Don't worry, my skills are not bad." The sharp razor slid across Sangar's neck. He felt a chill in his throat, and then he could no longer make a sound. In addition to the lethal poison, the razor was also coated with an anesthetic that could quickly paralyze a person. "My skills aren't bad, although I've only just learned," Aegon repeated, adding a little more to what he had just said. He picked up the razor and tried his best not to look at Sangar, whose face had turned blue. He then slammed the razor on the wooden table in the cell. Along with a crisp paw sound, this sharp but fragile weapon instantly broke into several pieces. According to the hint he had touched from the handle of the razor, as long as the blade was broken, the toxins on the razor would all dissipate after a dozen breaths, erasing the evidence of his murder. "I hope Fred hasn't gone mad," Aegon prayed. In the inscriptions on the hilt, besides telling him what to do, there were also 2 important hints. First, remove the wax patterns on the hilt. Second, no matter what happened after the deed, he had to keep a sacred silence in exchange for the amnesty that would eventually come. However, he felt like his heart was being gnawed away. This was not the first time he had killed someone, but it was the first time he had betrayed his ally. The sound was almost tangible, and it came from behind him. Aegon jerked his head back. The demon's gastrointestinal tavern. Oak Fist was in his room. He sat cross-legged on the floor, resting his folded arms on his knees and chewing spinewood to stay awake. Ever since the meeting with the 2 barbers, the lightning monk had been a little restless. "Did I forget something?" Oak Fist thought to himself. Although Stupid Bird and Strange Man behaved normally, they had usurped the power of the gang not long ago in an extremely cruel and ruthless way. Logically speaking, these 2 people should be arrogant and perverse people. But why didn't they have any intention of raising the price when they talked to me about such a dangerous business? It was as if they were trying their best to facilitate it. He was starting to regret not using lie detection when they met to make the deal. At least he could have known if the two were lying to him. Instead of sitting on the floor and torturing himself, he could only sit there and think hard. Knock, knock, knock. There was a knock on the door. "Who is it?" Oakfist asked in a low voice. He had already informed the tavern owner not to let anyone disturb his rest. And if his mercenaries came to pass on information, he had already left the window open, so they did not need to go through the tavern stairs. "Hello. The Public Security Administration of King's Landing City has sent someone here." A one-eyed bartender stood outside the door. His blind eye was covered with an eye patch, while his other eye was deep and unfathomable. "They have informed all the hotels and asked the guests to gather in the main hall of the pub. They said that they have something to inform everyone. Sorry to disturb your rest, but the matter is very urgent." Chapter 821. What's going on? I heard that the Public Security Bureau is catching thieves. No, their leader is carrying a notice. It seems like he wants to inform us of something important. All the passengers gathered in the tavern hall were whispering to each other, but the Public Security Bureau's action team turned a deaf ear to them and had no intention of restraining them. Therefore, they were not going to arrest anyone. Oakfist was mixed in the crowd. He judged that these Public Security Bureau members were indeed here to inform them of something important. Sure enough, when all the passengers had arrived, the squad leader of the operation team and the tavern owner, Gree, confirmed their arrival and then took out the notice that was tucked under his armpit. He stretched out his hand and shook the linen cloth, revealing the side covered with spells and runes. Oakfist immediately sensed that it was definitely a spell scroll made by a high-level spellcaster. A sense of crisis arose spontaneously. There was a crackling sound in the air. Some of the passengers were startled, and some even involuntarily grasped the handles of the weapons at their waists and arms, appearing to be anxious. Silence. Like a clap of thunder in a clear sky, the sonorous voice suddenly sounded. Everyone present felt a strong pressure in an instant, forcing them to stand still. Group immobilization spell, Oakfist thought to himself. Just as the voice sounded, the captain immediately spread the linen cloth on the floor and carefully made sure that the four corners were in a flat state, without any bulges or wrinkles. A light blue light radiated from between the runes and the spell, gradually converging into a cone-shaped light beam. Immediately after, something that looked like a golem appeared in the pillar of light. I'm Snade, the #1 spell consultant of the Scales of Eternal Order. The golem's gem-like eyes flashed, and its metal jaw opened and closed. Today, I've been ordered to do a live broadcast for you. You must open your eyes and watch carefully. After saying this, the two exhaust pipes behind the steampunk Demolic emitted a woo-woo sound, and smoke began to rise. As he chanted an incantation rhythmically, the smoke in the light pillar gradually revealed a brand new light and shadow. Oh God of virtual games. Oakfist couldn't help but mutter a gnomish prayer that he shouldn't have uttered here due to his shock at the sight before him. Fortunately, most of the people in the tavern were just as shocked as he was, so they didn't hear the lightning monk's words clearly. At the same time, they didn't recognize his identity. Within the smoke, the entire view of Junlin City was projected. All the spectators felt as if they were in the clouds. The electric monk carefully distinguished the grounds covered in limestone rubble. He only saw grass, stables, farmland, and a few low stone walls. The purple thistle flowers added a bit of beauty to the green grass nursery. The most advanced labor camp in King's Landing City. Oakfist recognized this place. Previously, in order to help Numan, who was a pirate of Joms, a grave robber, and a secret agent of the Scale of Perpetual Order, he had been here before. Beneath the building, which looked like a farmhouse, was a hidden dungeon. Moreover, the others might not know, but Oakfist, who had been planning a series of actions for the past 2 days, knew very well what was happening or had already happened. Calculating the time, the head of the Tradewind Merchant Guild, Sangar, should have died under the barber's razor by now. although the person who wielded the razor was actually the illegitimate son of the mayor of Red Pine, Sir Aegon. At this moment, the scene in the smoke changed again. The spectators seemed to have suddenly fallen from high altitude. Some of them even cried out in shock. When the scene stabilized again, everyone had already followed the magical eyeball into the ceiling of the labor camp and into the empty and gloomy dungeon. This place had become a kingdom of blood. How could this be? Oak Fist's eyes widened. In the dungeon, the Japanese prison guards who acted as guards scattered in all directions. There was a monster that looked very much like a spider sprite, the lower body of a giant spider but the upper body of a human, chasing after them. If he had been any slower, he would have been caught by the monster. Then the monster would raise its head, reveal a strange big mouth on its neck, and swallow the victim into its stomach. As the monster continued to swallow, it seemed to become more and more powerful. At first, it could only run in the corridor. Gradually, the spider sprite ran freely on the walls and ceilings. In the end, the monster began to use some spells. With a wave of its hand, it could spread a large amount of thick black fog that couldn't be dispersed. Once the Japanese prison guards were shrouded in the black fog, they would become headless flies and even crash into the monster's arms. This monster is a monster. While the spectators in the tavern were watching this horror broadcast attentively, the sonorous voice of the steampunk Demolik suddenly sounded as a narrator. It's the remnant of the monsters that ravaged the Ramsey continent 12 years ago. However, 1/3 of an hourglass ago, it was still an ordinary Ramsey human. At that time, his name was Sangar, the master of the Chamber of Commerce, and also one of the defendants scheduled for our public trial. Snyder's words resounded in Oak Fist's heart like a bell. This is bad. The lightning monk immediately realized that his previous plan had been exposed. He hired the barber to assassinate Sangar, to divert the attention of the scale of perpetual order and create an opportunity for himself to rescue or kill the dwarf investigator. However, his plan was used by the other party. Since some people can't wait, then we'll follow your wishes and bring forward this public trial. Hearing this, Oak Fist couldn't stay any longer. His palms were tightly clenched, and his nails dug into his palms. I have to escape from the devil's stomach. I have to kill Ablenstad immediately. Otherwise, I'll really fall into the devil's stomach this time. Slowly, the lightning monk moved slightly and squeezed his body into the crowd behind him. He silently chanted an incantation to worship the god in his heart, calling the divine existence to open its perception and cooperate with his thoughts to release the divine spell. However, just as the divine spell was about to teleport him away, Oak Fist suddenly felt a little strange. It was as if someone suddenly poured a basin of ice water on him after a strenuous exercise. He felt a chill all over his body. Out of nowhere, a humanoid silhouette appeared in the demon's stomach tavern. It was shrouded in a faint halo and looked like a holy petitioner. However, it was the exact opposite. It was a spirit extinguisher that could temporarily block out divine power. Chapter 822. Regardless of whether it was wearing a robe or revealing its loose and smooth, gelatinous muscles, its green and burning gaze always penetrated the shroud and illuminated the face that resembled a human but was somewhere between reality and illusion. Dark emblems floated around its body, and the characters that did not need to be supported displayed its heartfelt curse toward all living creatures and the divine. They were quenchers. They were invisible creatures that represented viciousness and the night. They despised all living creatures and the light that nurtured them. But the real source of their hatred was their hatred toward those who serve the gods. If possible, quenchers did not mind killing those high and mighty gods, although it was obvious that it was not easy for them to do so. However, even if they could not directly affect the gods, they did have the ability to break the connection between the gods and their followers. Because of this, they were usually willing to become the vassals of some accomplished necromancers and liches so that they could find a safe and suitable opportunity to pour their malice on the followers of the gods. Coincidentally, Snade had such quenchers under his command. In the island world, They had made great contributions to the scale of perpetual order when it came to dealing with the camel god. Now, it was the perfect opportunity for quenchers to show off their skills, or rather, have some fun, as they were hunting down a priest for the steampunk demi-lich. But in the end, only one quencher got such an opportunity. It happened to be assigned to travel with a security team that came to the Devil's Stomach. I'm very lucky. Quencher gradually turned from a halo to a solid form. Like a lover, it firmly grasped Oak Fist's two arms from behind. But for you, stupid blind follower, today must be a difficult day to endure. Even after turning into a solid form, Quencher's body was still sparkling as if it was inlaid with scattered diamonds. But all the guests in the tavern hall did not feel the slightest sense of beauty. Instead, they felt a chill in their hearts. Seeing this, the captain of the security team hurriedly gestured, and the team members behind him instantly swarmed forward. In order to complete this mission, the security team that went to various public places in King's Landing City for the public trial broadcast all carried a special ebony shackle. Snade had personally engraved 3 sets of magic circles on the shackle, which had the effect of sturdy spell, gravity spell, and weak magic soul pot. The first 2 would be used on the shackled lightning monk to prevent him from escaping, while the weak magic soul pot was prepared for Quencher to prevent the lightning monk from contacting the god of virtual games, Stim. It could be said that with Oak Fist's ability, he would not be able to escape with this shackle. Therefore, when the lightning monk saw the hunters walking towards him, he immediately resisted with all his might, trying to break free from Spirit Extinguisher, who was gripping his arm tightly. The gravel floor was covered with a layer of blood, and the broken limbs of the Japanese jailers were scattered among the blood. It was as if the last piece of the puzzle had been added to the eerie puzzle. Sengur, who had completely transformed into a spider-human, wandered around with waning interest. Its 8 muscular limbs brought it deeper and deeper into the dungeon. Soul Search has come back to life. A cold voice suddenly sounded. Sengar's head jerked back and saw a strong orc holding a long sword leaning against the wall, looking at him casually. This is not a good sign. Sengar's eyes widened. Honorable Calamity, General. Dog Tamer. The Spider-Man opened his mouth, and his mandibles popped out as he spoke. Please allow me to pay my respects to you. Its limbs were bent, making a kneeling posture, which was completely different from the arrogant and domineering attitude it had when it was killing people in the dungeon. It was a monster transformed from Soul Search by tribulation. The razor used to kill Sinjil was infused with deadly toxins and anesthetics, as well as a soul split from Soul Search's spirit. This was her specialty. Soul Search was a powerful soul sorcerer. She could feed on the souls of other creatures, and at the same time, feed them back. There was a two-way connection between the body and the soul. This was one of the results of the Emperor's research. The apprentice who learned this part of his ability was Calamity, General Soul Search. Therefore, she was able to force the soul of the Quencher into the body of the dead Sengur and reincarnate it into a new spider-human in the form of a monster. You came here. The dog tamer pointed at the Quencher's Quencher and said, just to kill these ordinary people? Every time Soul Search splits her soul, she will experience an indescribable pain. I don't see any reason why she created you just to carry out a massacre. Of course not. As if enraged by the dog tamer's frivolous words, the Spider-Man Sunjar hissed angrily. However, perhaps because it realized the identity of the dog tamer, it immediately shut its mouth and pretended to be submissive. My creator, the Honorable Tribulation General Soul Search, left me instructions. It stretched out a finger with a sharp claw and touched its temple. However, without enough killing, I can't become mature enough to make the reborn body fit the mutated soul. Now, Lady Soul Search's instructions have been clearly presented. I won't let her down. Someone made a deal with the newly resurrected Soul Search to let her kill Sengur, your predecessor. The dog tamer stood up straight. He stepped on the sticky pool of blood and walked step by step toward the spider-human Sengur. As he walked, the blazing flames immediately licked the blood off the soles of his feet, leaving no trace of filth. That person actually just wanted to create a diversion. But in the end, she wanted to be more thorough with the soul-searching. She wanted to kill the midget investigator directly. How did you know? The dwarf investigator is called Ablandstad. His father is called Darport. He was also a dwarf investigator when he was alive. The dog tamer suddenly had a skull-shaped artifact in his empty hand. We know each other. Daraport's skull. The spider-human singer was shocked. It recognized the artifact. You know him too? The dog tamer raised the skull. It seems that Soul Search's transformation for you is quite thorough. Loaded with the soul of the spider-human drow, you have become like them? Liar. Chapter 823. When Soul Search died last time, she shouldn't have had any memories of Daraport's skull at all, even if she was saved by Foolish Opinion and the Leopard Man. Those two generals didn't know anything about this dwarf skull. Only the dog tamer, Shurgu, the earth god, and the emperor himself knew about this illusion magic artifact, and only the dog tamer and the emperor could recognize it at a glance. If the spider humanoid Sangar could recognize Daraport's skull, then it must have some of the emperor's memories. In other words, Soul Search, who created this monster, wasn't Soul Search at all, or rather, it wasn't completely Soul Search, but the Emperor himself who had been resurrected with the help of Soul Search's soul magic and had returned to the world of Ramsey. This would also explain why the spies of the Scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce were sent out in full force to investigate and search the souls of the barbers, but they didn't find any trace of the bloodthirsty Leopard Man. On the day of the Emperor's resurrection 12 years ago, he had successfully escaped from the seal of the dwarf god, Garl Dazzlingold, by absorbing all the life force of the incarnation of the Calamity General who had saved him. Presumably, the Leopard Man had become a skeleton in a grave. It really is the Emperor's style of doing things, the dog tamer thought to himself. As a former general, he knew the other generals and emperors better than anyone else. He knew that Soul Search wasn't actually Soul Search at all. She was actually another general's wife, the wife that the Emperor had chosen for himself. In order to resurrect himself, he didn't hesitate to kill his wife. Sangar was shocked when he saw the dog tamer walking towards him with a gloomy face and an evil smile. The spider humanoid nervously curled up its limbs. It had made up its mind that as soon as the other party made the slightest move, it would immediately counterattack and run for its life. As a growth-type monster created by Soul Search, no. It should be said that the Emperor tore apart its soul and created it. As it continued to kill, its soul became more and more compatible with its current body, and Sangar recalled more and more of the Emperor's memories. This included the strange behavior of the dog tamer in the great battle 12 years ago. This Calamity General is very likely an enemy, the spider humanoid thought vigilantly. It reached its hand behind its back and clenched a long spike that had just grown out of its back. The spike was soaked with the poison it had secreted. However, when he was about 10 steps away from Chongar, the dog trainer stopped. Lava Lake Technique. The dog tamer chanted a simple incantation, and the bluestone floor beneath the Spider-Man's feet suddenly burst open. Blazing orange lava instantly gushed out from the cracks. Sangar cried out in alarm. His 8 limbs dug into the walls of the dungeon, trying to use the recoil to quickly retreat. However, 2 chains suddenly stretched out from the lava lake that had suddenly formed under its feet and pierced through the bulging spider body behind it. It was like using a blowtorch to clean the bristles of a pig before cooking. When the scorching flames licked through, the spider humanoid's hair was all burned to ashes. The weapon in its hand also turned into a pile of ash. You have to speak the truth. The dog trainer's voice suddenly appeared behind it. This former Calamity General had already teleported to the spider humanoid's back and was holding Daraport's skull against Sangar's head. First, there was the dazzling light. The colorful light began to spread across the spider humanoid's retina, and the 4 pairs of compound eyes on its face became dull. Then, there was a strange sound. It was as if the sound of an organ and a willow flute was playing in unison beside the spider humanoid's ears. Finally, there was the comfortable smell of blood. The sweet smell of rust filled every single one of the spider humanoid's sensory glands, and it did not dissipate for a long time. Under the full power of the dog trainer, the illusion magic energy was amplified by Daraport's skull and directly affected Sangar's brain at close range. It didn't even realize that its scalp had turned into ashes, its skull had turned into pus and flowed down, and its brain was being pulled bit by bit into the magical item made from the dwarf's skull. "Tell me, what is your plan?" The dog trainer asked in an unquestionable tone. His words caused the crystal skull-like Daraport skull to light up with pink light. Sangar's consciousness had already succumbed to the illusion. The Emperor only wants to ally with the dwarf god. He has reviewed his previous 2 failures. Because the dwarf was a factor in each of his failures, he urgently needs to resolve this unfavorable situation. Stim's core desire is to become the only god in this plane. He has been preparing for this for a long time, and he has promoted dozens of lightning monks from the Ramsey humans to serve him. This god has already made preparations to overthrow all the existing gods from the Ramsey continent and Dwarf Island. Not only the human gods, but the dwarf gods will also become his opponents. It can be inferred that in order to achieve his ambition, he will bear the pressure from the entire plane. In times like these, Stim needs a powerful ally who won't affect him. The Emperor's goal has never been the Ramsey plane. As the creator of my race, his plan, in the taverns of King's Landing, the live broadcast of the public trial stopped at the same time. It was as if the signal transmitted through the spell had been disturbed by something. The layer of smoke lingering in the light pillar suddenly shattered into pieces. After a while, the smoke returned to normal, and the scene in the dungeon was revealed again. At this moment, all the tourists who came to King's Landing, as well as other people who made a living in this city, held their breath. The sudden news made everyone feel as if someone had grabbed their throats and made it hard for them to breathe. That god named Stim is actually provoking all the other gods. He wants to start a war of gods in this plane. Stim is actually betraying the great Garl Dazzling. He wants to expel the beliefs of the other dwarf gods in this plane. Stim dares to cooperate with the Emperor. They may have already made other evil plans. That dwarf god is crazy. He wants to drag this world into the abyss of destruction together with the Emperor. At the same time, many speculations with the characteristics of conspiracy theories appeared in the hearts of many people. Many people, because of the waves in their hearts, even ignored the scene in the live broadcast, where the orc-like dog tamer turned into a spider, Sangar. However, they all had a similar idea. Stim had become the public enemy of the Ramsey plane. Chapter 824. The sedan stopped abruptly. Puwu waited for the sedan bearers to open the door, but seemed that he would not be able to do so even after the peak hour. The leader of the sedan bearers knocked on the outer wall of the luxurious sedan. "You're here," the other party shouted rudely. "How rude." Puwu stepped out of the sedan and grabbed his hat and cane. The leader of the sedan bearers immediately shook the reins and rode the other four-legged centaur sedan bearers into the night. The centaur cursed silently at the man, then turned around and looked up at Video Game Paradise in the Canish Zen Garden. Veterans called Video Game Paradise Nerd's new home. It was located at the end of Bronze Man Street in the Guild District, in other words, in the Canish Zen Garden, and adjacent to the big gym. Considering its internal business, the location was somewhat ironic. 7 hours before the peak hour every day, Video Game Paradise would welcome a brilliant sunrise. The light would shine on the Corinthian stone pillars erected in front of the building. An audacious newspaper once compared it to a diamond ring on the hand of a starving beggar. Considering its business situation in Sigil City, this analogy couldn't be more appropriate. After all, it was an industry that only country bumpkins would be addicted to. However, the operators here were well-versed in superficial skills. Anyone who visited before the peak hour would see a spacious marble walkway surrounded by fountains. The walkway led to a pair of towering, silver-plated doors. However, the doors paled in comparison to the majestic standalone building behind them. Puwu the centaur walked into the big crown, a huge replica of the crown-shaped artifact that was originally owned by the kobold god Kultimak and cleverly borrowed by the gnome Godgar, dazzling gold. He found that it was indeed as vulgar as the rumors said, but it was also expensive to build. He came to the Diamond Ranking Hall. The walls and floor here were scarlet as blood, symbolizing the intense competition and trials that the virtual game players in this segment would experience. A large number of leaves made of pressed gold foil were embellished, symbolizing that only by spending money could one quickly break through this segment. The hall ceiling was inlaid with countless small gems, from which the hall's name was said to come, shining under the light of a large chandelier. However, the flame on the chandelier flickered like a candle in the wind, and the hall was bitterly cold. There was no sign of life here, completely different from the usual bustling scene of country bumpkins. The only sound was Poo-woo's footsteps on the marble floor. A broken window solved the mystery of the source of the cold wind. The managers of the virtual game operations here were notorious for their bad tempers and all kinds of tricks. Could it be that they were the ones who did it? Or was there some other reason? His heartbeat was booming in his ears. Look, there seems to be a pair of boots behind the curtain. Poo-woo raised his hand to cover his eyes. Light and shadow flickered. In order to dispel the doubts in his heart, he walked over and opened the curtains. A corpse lay in the dark. The half-goat bent down and touched it. There was still some body temperature, but this guy was definitely dead, so he sprinkled a pinch of corpse-dissolving powder. The corpse's gray trousers had white stripes on one side, and its jacket was of the same style. A tall white feather hat was placed on the floor not far away. His attire showed that he was a messenger who ran around the streets of Sigil City. Taking advantage of the fact that the corpse-dissolving powder had not completely corroded the corpse, Poo-woo took one last look at the corpse. The man had a young face, but his actual age was probably much older than this face. His beard was shaved clean, and his expression was calm. There was a hole in one side of his head, and there was a black, wet stain on the ground. Where was his mailbox? With doubts in his mind, Poo-woo left the corpse behind the curtains, which had already turned into a pool of mucus. He lifted his cane, twisted it hard, and pulled out a sharp, poisoned sword that was a few inches long. He walked towards a tall corridor, where two hooded statues holding scepters stood guard on both sides. He stopped in between the ancient statues, took a deep breath, and glanced at a string of mysterious characters carved on the porch. Then, he pushed the door open and entered. This was an audience room. There was a circular staircase on both sides, which was spacious enough for 10 people to walk side by side. The staircase led to a high platform that stretched from left to right. When a diamond player was promoted to a higher level, a small ceremony would be held. At that time, a young girl holding a basket of flowers would walk up to the platform and scatter flowers to celebrate the promotion. There was a chair in the middle of the audience room. It was placed on the platform that was one arm above the ground. The kneeling cushions on the opposite side were specially used by members of the king's faction to serve the monarch. The room was brightly lit, but the source of the light was unknown. A man sat on the steps to Poo-woo's right. He was in his early 60s. His hair was silver gray, and his beard was neat with a few strands of black hair. His chin was quite thick, but it was of moderate size. His cheekbones were as if they had been carved by a knife. His skin was tanned from the sun, and there were deep wrinkles at the corners of his mouth and eyes. He was wearing a dark red uniform. On the left side of his chest was a silver badge with the pattern of a broken statue. On the right side of his chest, there were 9 golden military service marks. Each mark represented 5 years of service in the Challenger Troop of the Gods Association. There were no epaulets on his uniform to indicate his rank, but his brown eyes were full of vicissitudes of life. There was no doubt that he had once commanded thousands of troops. A handgun was placed on the steps next to him, and a hammer was already raised. He held a swift sword in his hand. He watched as a stream of blood slowly flowed down the steps, leaving a black line on the yellow and white marble floor. "Mr. President," the half-goat Poo-woo said. Poo-woo put his poison-short sword back into his cane. He then twisted his weapon and locked it with a click. Poo-woo raised his head. "I don't remember meeting you before, especially when I'm using this appearance." "Indeed," We haven't, Pu Wu replied. But I know very well that you're a regular customer of the Wheel of Fortune Casino. I won't waste any time on pleasantries. I'm here on orders. However, I don't know who summoned me, nor do I know why I'm here. You're right. The current leader of the Gods Association removed his disguise as two horns grew out of his head. His skin also turned magenta, just like his uniform. He now had his original appearance as a tiefling noble. The president stuck out his forked tongue and licked his sharp canine teeth. Shimshaka recommended you to me. She said that you're a more talented herbalist than your uncle, Thousand Herb Cup. He stood up from the steps. Only then did Pu Wu notice that the president had placed a dented mailbox under his but to serve as a cushion. Presumably, you can help me fake a perfect case of food poisoning. Pu Wu looked at the blood flowing down the steps next to the president. He thought of the corpses he saw outside the door, and he couldn't help but laugh. He said sarcastically, "That's it, that's it." The tiefling confirmed. Pu Wu nodded and extended his palm. "Give me the mailbox, and I'll give you a concocted Boda Corpse cerebrospinal fluid potion. Pour a little into the mouths of those dead players, and they'll come back to life in half an hourglass. Trust me, there's no other way to make those who were killed by firearms or weapons mutate after eating this unclean food. It's more like food poisoning." Chapter 825. Stim was a little frantic. He seemed to be a little far away from Tamora recently, but at the same time, he was favored by Ben Pasha. This might have something to do with him casually adjusting the drop rate of items in the virtual game. Damn the twin of destiny. Sitting on the throne in the temple, Stim's face was so long that it was about to fall to the ground. Do you really want to catch me and drag me to my death? He had just received the news that the business he had bought with great difficulty in Sigil City had suddenly broken out in a large-scale food poisoning incident. The group of country bumpkin customers who had just begun to indulge in virtual games had all turned into Bada corpses. In order to build the video game paradise, he had spent most of the divine power he had accumulated over the years to bribe the boss of the Wheel of Fortune, who was said to control most of the smuggling channels in Sigil City. That was the judge of Yugros, named Lady Shemishaka. What he had to do was actually very simple, which was to smuggle all kinds of equipment and raw materials from the Ramsey continent to Sigil City so that he could build an ultra-luxurious virtual game experience center in Cage City. However, because it was Sigil City, it was one of the few places in the entire multiverse where the gods could not spread their glory. Therefore, Stim had to pay such a high price. This was actually a shortcut he had specially laid for himself so that he could rush to become a mid-level divine power in one go after being promoted to a low-level divine power. Originally, if the video game paradise could operate smoothly, then new things like virtual games could be expanded to more dimensions through the powerful dissemination ability of the City of 10,000 Gates. In order not to anger the Lady of Pain, I did not directly build the video game paradise into my own temple, so I could not directly profit from those country bumpkins who were addicted to games. But as long as this plan was carried out smoothly, it would be extremely beneficial to the dissemination of the priesthood of virtual games. I should be able to receive a lot of benefits from the priesthood. Stim felt as if his heart was bleeding. This was originally a double insurance. It was so that after unifying all the beliefs in the Ramsey plane, not only would I be able to obtain a new source of belief, but I would also be able to become a mid-level divine power in time to resist the powerful enemies that would be established in the process of unifying all the beliefs in the Ramsey plane. But now, all these preparations have been ruined by the laughable food poisoning incident overnight. Hey, I won't let this go. However, that was in the future, and now, this human incarnation of a god, in order to conceal himself, Stim did not choose to use the image of a dwarf as his incarnation for this trip. He had no choice but to descend into the body of an electric monk, bent over a table full of snacks, picking out delicious sugar cakes. Despite the receding hairline, he could still be considered handsome, with short brown hair, full cheeks, and wrinkles at the corners of his mouth from smiling too much. His clothes were expensive, made of the fur of some animal from the east of Ramsey, and his long beard was in the style of Japanese. A hat and a cane were leaning on the table, showing the same casual and luxurious taste. While tasting the signature delicacies of this Japanese pastry shop named Multicolor Residence, Stim felt a little choked. He picked up the small, iron kettle on the table and poured himself a cup of herbal drink to relieve the grease. I really don't know what's so good about putting so much sugar in it. Even so, he still swept up all the pastries on the table. After all, he had already spent the money. He couldn't waste it. After this dwarf god had suffered a huge loss, he had unknowingly developed a stingy habit. This time, Stim came to King's Landing to ensure the smooth progress of his other plan. Although he couldn't set foot in the Sigil City in the Ramsey Plain, there was no place that could prevent a god from descending. At the same time, he had to have a talk with someone about the current situation. That was why he booked a private room in the pastry shop on the Wozang Commercial Street. You're really punctual. It's probably because of your camp. Ha ha. Frivolous laughter came into the box through the folding door made of silk and bamboo strips. Then, two people in hooded traveler's robes pushed the door open and walked in. The one who had just spoken was a young man. He lifted the hood on his head and unbuttoned his robe, revealing a colorful shirt inside. The person behind him kept his mouth shut. Even after he sat down, his face was still hidden in the shadow of his hood. Stim's incarnation snapped his fingers. The empty plates on the table were instantly filled with all kinds of fruits and pastries. Under the effect of the powerful illusion, not only did the transformed food look and taste exactly the same as the original food, it was even possible to pick it up and taste it without any problems. I'm used to being punctual. He showed a playful smile and looked at the two people who had just sat down after entering the room. I'm not as unruly as some stupid birds. I'm also not like some barbers who don't even bring a shaver with them. What do you mean? I mean to tell you to shut up. A dull voice suddenly sounded. The mysterious person sitting in the corner of the box raised a finger. When smart people talk, fools don't have the right to interrupt. His voice was neither male nor female. There seemed to be a dozen people stuffed under the brown traveler's robe. A light blue ray of light suddenly shot out from his fingertips, hitting squarely on Yu Jian's body. The fool howled and then turned into a parrot with colorful feathers. He stood on the ground with his legs curled up. I've made a fool of myself. I've been neglecting my discipline recently. The mysterious person took off his hood and revealed a terrifying face. There were no facial features on this face. There was only a swirl-shaped pattern in the middle of the purple face. What do you want, and what can you give me? Stim asked directly. The mysterious person sat up straight. As he moved, his majestic temperament naturally spread out. Whatever belongs to the gods, and whatever belongs to the emperors belongs to the emperors. He didn't beat around the bush and answered concisely. You and I will rule Ramsey together. After hearing the words of the mysterious person opposite him, Stim pondered for a moment and finally nodded. The failure of the investment was a big blow to him. It seemed that it was not impossible for him to change his next plan slightly. It sounds okay, but just as the incarnation of the god was about to raise some more conditions, there was a sudden noise outside the colorful residence. Stim and the mysterious person's expressions changed at the same time. They stood up and walked out of the box at the same time. Two colorful feathers fell from the parrot that was standing still. As soon as they touched the bamboo floor, the two feathers suddenly turned into human figures. Chapter 826. Every member of the scale of perpetual order understood this rule. They were also mentally prepared for the pain they had to go through to remove an abscess. Therefore, as soon as the order to mobilize the members of the Chamber of Commerce was issued, everyone was like a screw or a gear, quickly arriving at their assigned positions and starting to work. In stark contrast to the orderly and orderly members of the Chamber of Commerce, the ordinary citizens of King's Landing had become uneasy after learning that the Emperor was wallowing in the mire with the god of virtual games, Stim. 12 years ago, the days when the monsters wreaked havoc hadn't been long, but had infected the memories of every Ramsey citizen like a virus. Even the Outlanders who had only come to King's Landing to make a living in recent years were now talking about the future instead of business. The Wusong commercial street of King's Landing hadn't been very peaceful recently. The Meishing Chamber of Commerce, which had been the leader of the Wusong merchants in this area, had been severely punished because they were involved in the matter of the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce slaughtering the docks. As a last resort, the Meishing Chamber of Commerce had to sell the deeds to many of their shops at a low price. It was as if they had been unable to recover from the setback and were busy tearing down the east wall instead of the west wall. The Wusong immigrants living in this area had changed their customs of feasting and drinking in the past. Even if acquaintances met on the street, they would at most greet each other before hurriedly leaving. This long commercial street had many side roads. The Wusong immigrants had laid many small private railways on the side roads, connecting them to various shops and warehouses. In the past, the Meishing Chamber of Commerce's railcars would travel through these railways all day long, transporting fuel, stone, cement, various ingredients, alchemy potions, and other large quantities of goods to these shops and warehouses. But now, the transportation of goods had stopped. The Meishing Chamber of Commerce only left a few guards behind to stand guard at various points of the private railways. This was to prevent anyone from secretly using the railways that they had spent a lot of money to build to transport goods and reap the profits that belonged to the Meishing Chamber of Commerce. Our family's power is gone. Two Wusong warriors with moon-styled hair chewed on spinewood to refresh themselves while chatting to pass the time of their night duty. Hearing his partner's words, the other warrior hurriedly looked around. Then, he lowered his voice and scolded, "Don't talk nonsense. If others hear you, we'll all be dead the next time we shave." The two Japanese warriors on duty stopped talking at the same time, like the tentacles of a snail retracting under stress. It was hard to tell whether it was the actual warning or the effect of the night. In the autumn night, the cold wind rustled. The salty wind blowing from the ocean to the north of King's Landing City made the two warriors on night watch involuntarily wrap their robes tighter around themselves. At this moment, they all longed to return to their bright homes, stuff their frozen legs into the torches, and drink a bowl of refreshing warm tea. However, their wishes would definitely not come true tonight. After a series of rustling noises, the blood from their throats spilled onto the flagstones of the long street. A black shadow flashed past. The black-masked desert elf assassin waved his two scimitars and said, "Everything is false. Everything is allowed." Then, he melted into the night once again. Immediately after, a group of camel warriors with cotton cloth wrapped around their weapons to prevent them from bumping into each other followed the assassin, who opened the path for them. Their wide feet stepped on the stone path, making no sound. There were many similar groups, each led by one or two desert elf assassins, followed by the regular army of King's Landing City, who were armed to the teeth. In addition, there was a large number of gray dwarves carrying all kinds of heavy weapons at the back. These short and violent people had to be motivated to restrain the killing intent surging in their veins. Otherwise, they would most likely fall into the hands of the ruthless military judges. The military judges were all Pharaoh's blades of Nefermandis. Not only would these puppet creatures not listen to anyone's excuses, but they would also not accept any form of bribery. There was no need for that. They did not understand the concept of extrajudicial leniency. Powerful warriors, advanced weapons, and strict discipline formed the main body of the cleanup operation of King's Landing City's Wusong commercial street. However, due to the estimation of the mission target strength, they alone were not enough. Therefore, in the sky, the Eddy kobolds who had just assimilated to the scale of Perpetual Order a dozen years ago, and the Dragonborn kobolds who piloted single-person helicarriers powered by black oil engines were already in position. They were responsible for playing the prelude to the battle. What is that? A few Wusong warriors on duty at the Sky Guard Pavilion of the Yayoi clan were the first to discover this strange object descending from the sky. The oval magic bomb that looked like a watermelon flashed due to the activation of the magic runes on its surface, leaving a trail of light behind it as it entered their field of vision. In fact, the Yayoi clan's mansion was not the only place that was bombed that night. Many shops in the entire Wusong commercial street were baptized by the magic bombs at the same time. The barber shop, the house of colors, the Yayoi warehouse, any place where the barber organization's henchmen might gather, or where they might provide a meeting place for certain people, there was no exception. The King's Landing City's aviation unit used magic flames and metal shards to play the strongest prelude to this prelude. Immediately after, the warriors who had already hidden and marched to the predetermined location also blew the battle horn. The hunchback and polar bearman warriors in full armor let out battle roars that were loud enough to wake up the entire city as they charged in a formation that resembled a 3-by-3 formation. Unlike the small skirmishes of the operation team of the Security Bureau, this battle was initiated by the regular army under the command of the Scale of Perpetual Order. Their commanders were the 3 ogre brothers. Naturally, Neru, who always had the strength, would not miss the opportunity to enter the stage. Relying on the financial and material resources of the Scale of Perpetual Order, this muscular ogre with the atavistic talent had completely grown into a powerful legendary ogre warlord in just a few short decades. His body was already larger than the tallest storm giant or rune giant, so much so that the mecha that he once piloted had now been modified into his exoskeleton armor. Accompanied by a shrill sound that pierced through the air, the ogre, who was more than 60 feet tall, fell from the sky and crashed into the Yayoi clan's mansion. After he stood up, he casually waved his strengthened ebony chain, and the Sky Guard Pavilion collapsed into a pile of rubble. Chapter 827. After completing the bombing mission, Eddie and the airmen of the Dragonborn clan hovering in the sky began to release their multi-axis cantilever propeller drones. These drones descended from the sky and formed a buzzing swarm. Shay, the great engineer of the ingenious craftsman, who was hired by the Scale of Perpetual Order, controlled the drones to patrol the Wusong commercial street. The built-in magic identification system allowed the drone swarm to lock onto a location in the commercial street. Like sharks smelling blood, they rushed madly to the pastry shop called the House of Colors. As it gradually approached, each drone quickly switched to fire mode. Driven by the motor, the nested reloader locked the fully charged gun barrel with a click. Dense bullets poured out from the muzzle like a storm, initiating an indiscriminate carpet fire. Tat, 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 tat. Like a galloping horse stepping on the road, the sharp steel bullets shattered every single tile on the roof of the colorful house. The wooden pillars and brick walls didn't last long and soon fell under the baptism of the bullets. Fortunately, because Stim wanted to have a secret meeting with the Emperor, the god played a little trick in advance. After the pastries were served on the table, everyone, including the staff and the chef, got off work early and returned to their own homes under the influence of a hint. However, after plowing the ruins with bullets several times, Shay, who was controlling the drone swarm, helplessly threw away the controller in front of him. Although the magic identification system finally confirmed that there were no traces of divine spells or magic in this place. But after all the effort, they only killed a general who was stunned by the malice transfiguration. Considering the recent activities of Foolish Opinion, he probably did not have less than half of his former strength. It was somewhat discouraging. Attention, Steel Ogre. Using the communication device, Shay contacted Neru, who was plowing the courtyard and sweeping the caves in the secret base of the Barber organization, and remembered to inform him of the failure of the mission. The gnomes and monsters have temporarily escaped from King's Landing. Only Foolish Opinion has been eliminated. The reverse maze has begun to operate. Got it. Nalu, who was in the middle of a fierce battle, immediately replied loudly in the communication channel when he heard the news. Following his reply, a small warhead suddenly jumped out from the shoulder of the Storm exoskeleton mech and quickly jumped into the air. The warhead suddenly exploded, bursting with a brilliance that resembled a crimson chain. All of the Monarch's Descent City troops in this commercial street saw this scene and quickly moved according to the instructions they had received before the battle. The ground forces, which were mainly composed of camel people and polar bear people, were the first to give up on attacking their target. They were all wearing the latest model of fanatic armor. Not only did it give these warriors greater strength and defense, but it also made their movements extremely fast. When they saw the signal flare rise into the air, they immediately gathered at the Yayoi family's mansion. The elemental shamans of their respective tribes followed these warriors, or rather, they were escorted by a large number of warriors to the assembly point. As soon as they were in position, the elemental shamans began to cast spells together in the square near the raised Heaven's Guard pavilion. Elemental power began to gather at the summoning of the spellcasters. They first gathered the rubble on the ground together, then broke it down and rebuilt it into a new fortification. When a spell was cast, a fortress with 13 protruding corners took shape. A tall tower stood at each corner of the fortress, and a composite landing pad that looked like a large dish rack rose in the square in the center of the fortress. Like bees returning to their hive, the airborne troops hovering in the air quickly landed. Just as the fortifications were ready and the troops were stationed, a light screen suddenly appeared on the periphery of the Wusong commercial street. 6 large brass totem poles were placed in predetermined positions, the dense runes on them glowing with a deep blood-red light. Under the control of the powerful Demolic, the components of the compound lock were instantly activated. Relying on the cables and coils buried deep underground, they began to greedily absorb the power from the large power plant in the center of the city. Lightning shot out from the top of the 6 brass totem poles and intersected in the sky, making crackling sounds. These lightning bolts were the truss structure of the rising light screen, responsible for converting the electricity into the magic energy needed to operate the lock. This lock was inverted, which meant that it wasn't used to defend against external attacks, but to trap something inside. Based on the arrangement of runes and spells, Snade had set up 3 functions: isolating divine power, weakening soul power, and confining corruption spells. For this, the steampunk Demolic had used 2.5 dozen spirit extinguishers, thousands of top-quality soul prisms, and a large number of obsidian magic beads that were urgently transported from the Ash World. The reason for that design was to trap the clone of the god of virtual games, Stim, and the Emperor who was resurrected by Calamity's soul-searching body. The scales of the Eternal Order Merchant Guild had already learned that the two were meeting at the Wozang Trade Street through rigorous logical analysis and prophecy spells. And after the drone swarm under Shay's control failed and the two escaped from the multicolor residence, the maze naturally became a contingency plan for the entire plan. Now we are facing 2 problems. After setting up all the magic circles, the steampunk Demolic could finally breathe. Scorching steam overflowed from the portable boiler in his body, and the steam flowed through a series of steam whistles that were combined into a complicated sound structure, and a slightly sharp voice was emitted through the brass trumpet. This lock is not foolproof. If the 2 fellows were to act out of desperation, although they were unlikely to do so in the short term because they were hoping that the other party would be more eager to break the lock could only hold for about 3 hourglasses. After all, it was definitely not an easy task to besiege a god's avatar and a legendary tier spellcaster who was at the most conservative estimate. Also, if the 2 are to encircle our fortress, ruin his army can only hold for 1 or 2 hourglasses at most, even if they are carrying a large number of heavy weapons. Hearing that, the ogres Brock and Paulu were a little worried for their brother, while the paladin Jensen and the desert elf Brock were more optimistic. If Snader's estimation was correct, the Demolic's calculations had never failed, and the only time he had failed was when he was captured by Quest decades ago and was hired by Quest. Then 2 hourglasses plus 3 hourglasses would mean a total of 5 hourglasses of time, which would be enough for the magic lock to last until dawn. And when that time came, all the problems would no longer be a problem, because the sleeping keys would awaken. Chapter 828. After a long and deep sleep, a huge creature finally welcomed its own dawn. Under the illumination of the morning sun, Quest finally opened his eyes. Hundreds of Paleson miles north of King's Landing City, the ocean became unruly because it was far away from the great city. The raging waves woke up the megalosaurus that was lying on the surface of the sea. "Why am I here?" When his consciousness returned, Keyes immediately thought of this question. Shouldn't I be in the Emperor's noble artifact? Before falling into a deep sleep, he still remembered that he resisted the urge to sleep and presided over the excavation of the Emperor's lair at the protruding promontory. In the end, he found that it was actually an important laboratory of the Emperor, as well as a flying machine that was prepared for interdimensional warfare. Because of the Megalosaurus race's habits, he immediately decided to use the noble artifact, which was mainly made of adamantine, as his temporary lair in order to have a good dream. However, as the deep sleep continued, Keyes's huge body, which was already far superior to his peers, once again experienced a leap in growth. Although he could not feel hunger because he was in a dream, his body was still honest. His adaptive talent was activated again, and Keyes began to use every inch of his skin that was stuck to the adamantine spaceship to absorb the elements in the noble artifact. Just like when he swallowed copper and iron when he was young, in the process of transforming from a young dragon to a young dragon, Keyes could not help but eat all of the Emperor's hard work. He turned the spaceship, which was made of adamantine and the entire Ramsey plane, into food to fill his stomach. However, Keyes was still very hungry now. Therefore, before he woke up, he was involuntarily sent to the outer sea far away from King's Landing City. Subconsciously, the Megalosaurus was eager to eat a sumptuous breakfast. I see. It did not take long for Keyes to understand the cause and effect. He twisted his body. Layers of foam quickly dispersed around the huge, island-like Megalosaurus, disappearing and reappearing continuously. The rippling water was like a dense marble texture. He opened his eyes wide, like a crocodile that was about to hunt its prey. He scanned the sea within dozens of parasan with his eyes. Although this place was already far away from Junlin City, there were still some ships sailing in the vicinity. He saw a few merchant ships sailing on the waterway. Some sailors who were not on duty sat on the side of the ship with their legs hanging over the side. Sometimes they used simple fishing rods to fish, and sometimes they used knives and coal black paint to process bones or whale teeth to make carvings. Fortunately, these ships weren't eaten by the Megalosaurus for breakfast. They weren't plentiful enough. The converging ocean currents brought a lot of organic nutrients to this place. All kinds of algae flourished here, and schools of fish that fed on algae also wandered here in search of food. Keyes dived into the water. He could see black shadows, which were huge schools of fish. The Megalosaurus moved its limbs and leaped out like an arrow from a bow. It opened its mouth wide and bit off a large piece of the black shadows. Chasing the traces of the school of fish, Keyes happily enjoyed the small dessert before the meal. He was also mentally prepared to welcome the big meal. Unlike ordinary animals, the Megalosaurus was a magical creature with extremely high intelligence. It was true that he followed his instincts to eat, but what he thought about in his mind was not just a simple hunting strategy. He remembered that before he fell asleep, he had seen the books in the private library in the Emperor's laboratory, the anatomy of a flood dragon, the predatory behavior of sea creatures in the cold tide area, Ramsey's study of marine behemoths. They were all monographs that the Emperor had personally written for the results of his research. In Keyes's mind, a large number of fascinating and exquisite illustrations from the books appeared. For example, there was an ancient fish with a flat head that was more than 30 feet long. There was also a pseudo-horn shark with uneven teeth and a protruding forehead. There was also a flood dragon that had a curved neck like a swan and relied on its flippers and tail to swim under the sea. Most of these predators had large bodies and were suitable for slowly chewing. Although he was almost drooling, Keyes still wanted to save face. He closed his mouth without a trace, as if the hot saliva in his mouth had nothing to do with him. While he was lost in his thoughts, he chased after the dessert to his heart's content. Quest's body gradually sank into the depths of the sea. He finally found a decent meal. He found a crazily fleeing kraken. The so-called kraken was actually a kind of sea monster. The front half of their body was like a catfish with 2 claws, and the back half was like an octopus with disturbing ring patterns. According to the research of a famous scholar in the multiverse, Krakens were a powerful magical beast created by some angry gods related to the sea. Those gods used their terrifying appearance to spread terror and punish the mortals who did not respect the gods. Krakens could easily use the tentacles on their back to drag a moving ship into the sea. Its gigantic, catfish-like mouth was capable of swallowing the terrified crew members into its stomach in an instant. Or, in certain seasons, Krakens would swim upstream for no reason under the influence of their ancient depression. They would follow the river channels that connected to the sea and destroy the villages and towns along the coast one by one. After venting their anger, they would be able to find their inner peace again. As a kind of famous sea monster, they had left behind too many legends about themselves. However, in those stories, Krakens were mostly the main characters who committed atrocities. At the very least, they were the main antagonist who suffered from the crusade of many heroes. But now, Krakens had only sensed a trace of an ominous aura, and they were frantically running away. This situation could be said to be one of a kind. They had no choice but to run. Krakens were scary, but the creature behind them was much scarier. Krakens were as big as a few whales with their heads and tails connected, but they were only big enough to be bitten by the giant beast behind them. Krakens were born with powerful spellcasting abilities, but did Keys not have this ability? In this day and age, who did not know how to use a few spells or supernatural abilities? Force Field Cage. The Megalosaurus, chasing after Krakens, was a little annoyed, so he used an ability that originated from the Power Dragon. The surging force field energy suddenly rushed out. Keys, who had grown into a young dragon, was much better at controlling force fields than before. Kraken, who was in the middle, was squeezed by an overwhelming force from all directions. For a moment, the sea monster was trapped in the sea water that it was most familiar with, as if someone had pressed the stop button on the screen. The hungry giant dragon opened its big mouth, and the scorching heat penetrated the barrier of the seawater, instantly roasting the Karakin until it was charred on the outside and tender on the inside. Oh, with just one bite, the sea monster that originally dominated this sea area only had a few tentacles left floating in the water. It has the taste of both teppanyaki squid and grilled fish. Keys could not help but lick his lips as the delicacy entered his stomach. Krakens must be added to my personal menu in the future. I'll touch them from time to time. Chapter 829. Whoosh! Poking his head out of a large eroded hole in the seabed, Keys chewed and swallowed the deep-sea behemoth that he had just pulled out with satisfaction. Like the krakens that he had devoured before, this was also a huge sea monster that tasted very delicious. In order to hunt down such a legendary creature, Keys had been diving in the depths of the ocean for half an hourglass. Along the way, he could only rely on attacking time and time again, plucking the huge chelicerae from the body of this sea monster that looked like a mixture of a lobster and a whale to replenish his strength. However, hard work would eventually pay off. After eating several appetizers, the deep-sea behemoth had an extremely strong regenerative ability. Keys finally had a decent meal and finally filled his stomach that had been rumbling since he woke up. Burp. The Megalosaurus burped with satisfaction. Blazing heat spewed out from its throat, and a water column that was dozens of feet high suddenly rose from the sea more than 1,000 yards away. Now that I've finished breakfast, it's time to settle those matters. In fact, when Keys had just woken up and his consciousness had yet to return, the steampunk Demolic had already detected the huge energy fluctuations caused by his use of the teleportation spell. While he was eating breakfast, Snade had used an enhanced communication spell to communicate with him, conveying the current situation in King's Landing City to this young dragon, who had just woken up, although it was a little untrue. Therefore, since he had already filled his stomach, Keys did not want to waste any more time and directly rushed to the surface of the sea. Before using the advanced teleportation spell again, not only did he have to carefully calibrate the coordinates of the destination, but he also had to dry off the water on his body. Otherwise, with his current body that was comparable to the size of an island, he would crush the fragile city at the same time as he appeared, or bring a large amount of salt into the city, bringing a crisis to the city's industrial and agricultural production. Should I transform into a human and use the advanced teleportation spell again? This idea flashed through Keys's mind. However, after growing into a young dragon, for some unknown reason, he seemed to be somewhat resistant to the idea of transforming into a humanoid creature. He vaguely felt that if he continued to transform into his human form as frequently as before, it might have an adverse effect on his future. Let's measure the coordinates again. Keys, who had always followed his heart, decided to return to King's Landing in his megalosaurus form. Because of this, he had to be careful. However, it was not easy to locate the coordinates in the vast sea. The young blue dragon swam for a while. There were only fawn-like rocks between the waves, but there was nothing special. Then he saw a huge iron tower standing in the sea. A flame mixed with oil flickered at the top of the tower. It was a platform suspended above the sea. It was more than 200 square feet in area, and its weight was supported by 3 thick metal supports. The waves slapped against the brackets, making loud, banging sounds. On the platform, there were clusters of seemingly messy spires, and the crane was like a moving claw. At the top of the platform was a huge iron tower made of overhead beams. Occasionally, flames would drip from the top, and the ripples caused by the magic energy distorted the space above the flames. In the shadow below the platform, a metal pipe was inserted into the sea. The internal structure of the platform flashed with light. A few armored patrol ships circled around the platform. Their decks were sometimes bright and sometimes dark, and they communicated with each other with light signals from time to time. There is no doubt that this should be an offshore drilling platform. Keys, who was lurking in the water, thought quickly. But the question is, why is there such a platform in this sea? Who is mining the black oil resources under the seabed here? He observed for a moment from a distance away from the platform, but he did not see any creatures coming out from the platform or the armored ships. With doubts in his mind, Quest circled around for a while. In the end, he found another platform with flames on top of it 30 kilometers away from the platform. It was bigger than the previous one. It stood on 4 weather-beaten concrete pillars. The platform structure was more sparse, and there was a short and thick tower at each corner. There was also a large crane operating at the edge. On this fixed platform, Keys finally found the creature operating the platform. Shouldn't the gnomes stay on Gnome Island? When did they start building permanent and semi-permanent offshore platforms so far away from Gnome Island? The young blue dragon fell into deep thought. A gust of wind blew on the sea, and the weather was as cold as iron. He circled around hundreds of pale sand, and together with the 2 he had found before, he found a total of 5 offshore platforms. 4 of them were semi-permanent and seemed to be able to be towed by barges. One was a permanent building with a large number of berths under the platform for large ships to rest. Not only that, Keys also figured out the approximate location of this place. Still benefiting from the books he had read before, he distinguished from the chain of small islands scattered in this sea area that were shaped like sawtooth that should be a place named Fin Islands by the Emperor. King's Landing City was at least 2,000 pale sand to the south, and Gnome Island was about 1,000 pale sand to the west. The Fin Islands were a completely barren land in the Ramsey Plain. When the Emperor toured the plain, he had already explored this place and found that there were no intelligent creatures living on the islands. There were basically no signs of magical creatures. The vegetation on the islands was mostly cold-resistant and salt-resistant shrubs, and there was a lack of wood that could support beams and houses. In short, this island was very barren, so the Emperor named it Fin, which was similar to chicken ribs. But now, Keys found traces of gnomes here, which made him hesitate. I have to use magic to solve this problem. The young blue dragon's nostrils flared, and a surge of heat surged out. A large amount of mist rose from the sea. However, the mist did not dissipate with the wind, but was pulled into a thin mist line under the effect of magic. One end was connected to the megalosaurus, which was the origin, and the other end was pointed to a distance that could explain Keys's doubts. Keys's speed could no longer be accurately described as an arrow released from a bow. Driven by curiosity, he moved underwater at a speed comparable to an intercontinental missile. If he did not remember to use magic to eliminate the movement he caused in the process of moving, there would have been a huge tsunami in the sea. After a while, Keyes crossed the chain of islands of Finn Islands and saw an underwater mountain named Sundial Rock by the Emperor. The top of this mountain protruded out of the sea like a probe. Under the sunlight, this natural sundial would cast a long and narrow shadow shaped like a pointer on the lush mangrove dial at its base. Chapter 830. On the horizon far away from Sundial Rock, Key saw a city standing in the middle of the sea. It was located between clumps of cold-resistant cold water corals, built of concrete, steel, rock, and glass. Many pillars were surrounded by spiral-shaped walkways and connected by bridges as thin as silk. At the top of the dark castle stood a complex conical spire, up to 100 feet high. The entire building complex was filled with incompatible styles. The messy silhouettes against the sky were like exaggerated coral reefs in children's graffiti. The protruding towers seemed to be alive, and their shape was similar to clusters of tube worms. Some of the high-rise residential buildings imitated the shape of lace corals, with long and narrow houses distributed among the branches, and the low ring-shaped buildings with many windows were like giant cylindrical sponges. Some other buildings showed a corrugated structure of flaming coral. In the underwater city, row upon row of tall towers stood above the waves. The doorways that were at sea level were like big mouths. Green floating algae residue marked the height of the tide line, and when the tide rose, these doorways would be submerged. There were also newer buildings here. The oval-shaped buildings cut out of rock were inlaid with iron bars on the surface, and the underwater roof protruded from the protruding supports, holding them up. Rows of short brick houses were built on the floating platforms, which looked out of place in the sea. From above sea level to the distant high places, the walkways and bridges were filled with thousands of midgets, and a certain number of other creatures were mixed in. Dozens of flat-bottomed cruises and small boats leisurely traveled between the towers. The ships that were ready to go out to sea were anchored outside the city, tied to the pillars in the sea. They were all fishing boats, sampans, and sailboats. Occasionally, there were a few steamships and the ironclads that Keyes had seen near the offshore drilling platform. Another midget city, Keyes thought to himself. Who built this city? Following his thought, the young blue dragon suddenly appeared on the street above the sea. He had to transform into a midget. When he came closer, he could feel what the other creatures he had just seen were. It turned out that they were also midgets. However, the appearance of these pygmies was different from ordinary pygmies. They were taller than ordinary pygmies, close to half the height of a normal human. Their upper bodies had small gills on their necks. Living underwater for a long time had caused their skin to be much paler than ordinary pygmies. Below their waist, in addition to 2 legs, they also had a tail covered in hard armor. Their large and rough shell and interlocking body segments were like giant lobsters. The lobster's eyes and tentacles were replaced by the dwarf's abdomen. Even in the relatively unfamiliar air, the appendages under the numerous tails were similarly complex and nimble. When they walked, they would make a slight knocking sound. These lobster pygmies, or aquatic pygmies, usually wore clothes woven from some kind of tough seaweed fiber. They also liked to decorate their hard-shelled tails with tattoos, carving patterns there and coloring them with various kinds of extracts. On the side of the hard-shelled tails of some of the older aquatic pygmies, Keyes could see through invisibility. He also discovered some special rune arrays drawn with invisibility paint. Cold resistance increase, rigid skin, cat's elegance. Keyes recognized the effects of many of the rune arrays. He was surprised to discover that if he were to look at it in terms of percentage, the proportion of spellcasters who were qualified to draw and activate the invisibility rune arrays among the aquatic pygmies was much higher than that of ordinary pygmies. Moreover, compared to the illusion-type spells that the pygmies were originally good at, The talents of these aquatic pygmies seemed to be more inclined towards the defense type and the transformation type. After walking across a bridge and seeing that there was no one around, Keys immediately transformed into an aquatic pygmy. He jumped down from the stone stairs and quickly sank into the sea. Under the sea, there were many submersibles that were obviously in the style of the pygmies swimming continuously like large metal fish. The anchors and chains hanging down from the sea formed some areas that were difficult to pass through. If they wanted to pass through, they could only go around or move as slowly as possible. It was a stark contrast to the agile aquatic pygmies. There were floating lights everywhere. The cold, moon-like light balls were completely different from the orange-red color of the gas lamps on the streets of Pygmy Island at night in Key's memory. The entire underwater city flickered in the dark water, like a rope net that was hung with will-o'-the-wisps. Moreover, unlike the cities on land, this underwater city was more like a three-dimensional city. Its periphery was a cluster of low buildings, distributed among the porous rocks and corals. The whole city had more than a dozen spoke-like main roads that gradually climbed from the periphery of the city to the center of the city. The top of some of the buildings were either faintly visible above the water surface, or they were directly exposed above the sea surface. However, the other buildings that were not in the center of the city were not only tall, some of them were even built directly along the bottom of the sea. In short, this was a city that was intertwined and extended in all directions. Although this underwater city seemed to be silent from the surface of the sea, it was actually very lively. There were aquatic pygmies everywhere in the city. Every few blocks, there was a special commercial street. Colorful cloth was hanging in front of the shops, and aquatic pygmies were speaking a variant of the pygmy language and bargaining passionately. Small squares were planted with neatly trimmed kelp, and aquatic pygmy farmers were arguing about which crops should be planted at this time of the year. The streets and alleys were crisscrossed, and there were caravans full of goods. The aquatic pygmy coachmen manipulated huge crab-like beasts that were more than 8 feet tall to carry large amounts of goods. Children playing in their own coral yards would occasionally use sticks to tease the lanternfish that were locked in the fences. After spending a while, Keys roughly browsed the layout of the entire city, and then he found his target. It was a complex building located in the center of the city. Its spherical surface was covered with wrinkles, and it looked like an unbelievably large brain coral. Surrounding this building, there were many towers that pierced the water surface and into the air. The outer walls of these towers were decorated with hieroglyphics and phonetic characters, the characters used by the pygmies in different periods of time. The open windows and doorways allowed small fish to enter and exit unhindered. However, the spherical building, which was the main building, was sealed. It was equipped with a large number of small round windows made of crystal and thick metal doors. A string of bubbles continuously emerged from the air vent, rising to the sea surface. This was the Pygmy Temple. Chapter 831. That was the Temple of Gar Glittergold. The god of dwarfs, Gar Glittergold, looked like a handsome dwarf with golden skin and eyes that shone like gemstones. He usually liked to wear gorgeous clothes and accessories. In the Temple of Ramses Dwarf Island, the statue of the dwarf god wore a silk tuxedo and a pair of silk stockings. Unlike the image of a master of mischief that many people were familiar with in the eyes of the dwarfs, this god of dwarfs was actually more like a vigilant protector. Ever since the dwarfs left the kingdom of fairies, this kind god began to take care of them, extraditing them to various planes of the multiverse to reproduce and spread their branches and leaves. Under his careful care, the dwarfs, who were slightly weak but occasionally caused some trouble, were able to establish themselves in many worlds. And because of this, Gar Glittergold was loved and respected by most dwarfs. As a successful god of dwarfs, he had already reached the peak of the great divine power a long time ago. In the recent tens of thousands of years, due to the experience brought by the passage of time, Gar Glittergold had become less directly involved in the lives of the dwarfs. However, as long as the dwarfs had problems that were difficult to solve, he was still happy to respond to his believers, even if some of the problems involved conflicts with certain gods. Although Garglittergold didn't like this, his power was undeniable. When necessary, the dwarf god would also pick up his netherworld dancing battle axe called Aram Dinar and fearlessly resolve those disputes. To be fair, Keys definitely didn't want to be enemies with Garglittergold. So, even if he encountered the obstacle of Dwarf Island when developing his power, he didn't have the intention to destroy the Ramsey dwarfs. Keys didn't want to use his own skull to test the sharpness of a great divine powers weapon. From the beginning to the end, he only wanted to deal with the dwarf, the god of virtual games. Keys passed through a spacious and dark doorway and entered the interior of a side building. The aquatic dwarf priest below waved his arms and guided him to the end of the enclosed concrete corridor. A huge door slammed shut behind him. Huge bubbles suddenly gushed out of the thick pipes lining the wall. The seawater was forced out through valves and floodgates. The water level slowly lowered. His legs gradually landed on the concrete floor, and the water level dropped below the parotid gland. The water droplets flowed down Keys's body, leaving traces on the ground. The aquatic midget priest who had guided him earlier also walked in. He opened a tight valve, and a pleasant breeze blew in, carrying the scent of cinnamon and apples. It seemed to be used to cover the smell of seaweed and fish that existed in the temple. Behind the priest stood a female aquatic dwarf. She seemed to be a warrior and held a spear in her hand. However, it was too delicate. Keys guessed that it might be a ceremonial tool and not a weapon. The priests and warriors wore bright green breastplates on their upper bodies. They were not made of metal, but more like polymer. In the middle of the breastplates, there was a faint, glowing golden pattern. I didn't mean to offend you. Keys calmed his mind and tried to speak the words that matched the aquatic dwarf sentence pattern, pronunciation, and grammar with the help of the glib tongue and the vocabulary he had heard during his tour of the underwater city. The two aquatic dwarves understood his words and began to talk with him. Their language was clattering, and a short vibrato could be transmitted in the air and water. Your visit has been known to our Lord. The priest carefully corrected Keys's tense. Please move into the temple and listen to the teachings of the great god. The young blue dragon, who had transformed into an aquatic dwarf, nodded in agreement. He followed the two priests and walked along a wide corridor into the main building of the temple that looked like brain coral. When he walked in, he found that the arc-shaped dome of the temple had been cast with a divine spell. It was as if it was made of completely transparent glass, and he could see the situation outside without any hindrance. A circle of huge aquatic plant petri dishes surrounded the edge of the building. A large number of gorgeous marine plants grew inside, like a huge flower garden. Some parts of the walls were covered with brocade, showing the various stories of how the city rose from the depths of the ocean. The ground was covered with white slabs, which were quite dry and looked warm under the effect of magic. Stepping on them, one would not feel the chill under the sea at all. After leading Keys into the temple, the two aquatic dwarves took their leave. The great dwarf god wanted to meet guests, and they were not qualified to stay here. When they left, a water curtain suddenly rose from the door, and the original door disappeared in an instant. The temple seemed to be integrated, standing alone in the depths of the ocean. Do you like liquor or cocktails? A playful voice suddenly sounded. Keys looked at the center of the temple, and a handsome dwarf with golden light suddenly appeared. He held two small wine glasses in his hands. When he saw Keys looking at him, the dwarf smiled and greeted him. I guess it's the latter. So please, Mr. Keys. Keys had just entered the stage of youth, and he was invited to drink. It was completely in line with Gart, dazzlingly's clever and mischievous temperament. He could not refuse. He could only reach out his hand, and a cup that was originally in the hands of the gods suddenly appeared in Keys's palm. There was a pool of light green liquor in the cup, and there was a faint smell of grass floating out. Let's drink this cup and wish you a long life, ha ha ha. Gart dazzlingly took the lead to drink up the wine in the cup. When he saw Keys do the same, he immediately revealed a smile as if he had succeeded in his scheme. In order to entertain guests, I specially got the secret cocktail recipe of a certain ogre gourmet, and I also found the most important seasoning in it. It was provided by his brother, and it has the effect of improving energy. You named it the six gods yourself. The taste of this cup of wine is very authentic, isn't it? Guard dazzlingly winked at Keys. If it were not for the fact that he might not be able to defeat him, Keys, who was very intoxicated after drinking the special cocktail, would probably have rushed over to give this mischievous god an unforgettable lesson. However, he could only endure it for now. In the future, Keys secretly cursed in his heart, but he still had a smile on his face and said flattering words. Of course, your cooking is very authentic. However, I'm curious. Why did you let someone guide me to this meeting? Chapter 832. After a short meeting, the hospitable gnome master god, Dazzling Gold, gave Keys a breakfast that he would never forget. After that, the young blue dragon walked out of the temple that was shaped like a brain coral. He directly transformed into the form of a megalosaurus and emerged from the water. He spread his wings and flew towards King's Landing City. After Keys left, Dazzling Gold immediately summoned his chief aquatic gnome priest and solemnly instructed him. From today onwards, we must add a few more dishes to the secret dishes of the underwater city. We can't let that megalosaurus know that today's dishes were all made up by me. Perhaps some people would think that Keys was in a bad mood. After all, before he flew out of the sea, he had accidentally swung his tail when he transformed into the form of a megalosaurus, causing all the towers of Dazzling Gold's temple to collapse. However, the young blue dragon was actually in a good mood. Although his tongue had suffered a little, his stomach definitely wouldn't. He had gotten a promise in exchange for this meal. The powerful gnome master god made it clear that he would not take any hostile measures against Keys just because he wanted to target Stim. He would also restrict all gnome gods except Stim from interfering in this matter. According to what he said, the domain of divinity that Stim had chosen had already shown a terrifying characteristic that could destroy the curiosity and creativity of the gnomes. It was precisely because of this that Dazzling Gold would build such a shelter-like city in the Cold Claw Sea north of the Sundial Rock. The first inhabitants of this place were all transported here from Gnome Island through secret channels. These people didn't have a good life on Gnome Island. They were neither happy nor comfortable. Among them were some gnome scholars who had been persecuted by Stim's priest because of their research on the theory of the dangers of addiction to virtual games. That was why Dazzling Gold had rescued them one after another. The gnome master god had always insisted on this sheltered city plan. Starting from the day that the god of virtual games, Stim, ascended to the divine throne, he had kept the gnomes of this sheltered city in check for 300 years. In the history of Pygmy Island, these pygmies were the sum of all the traveling population and missing population in the past 300 years. In order to let the dwarfs live a better life in the city of Shelter, Gaul dazzlingly spent a lot of divine power to create a subspecies of dwarfs called aquatic dwarfs. Almost 2 whole generations of curious dwarves had volunteered to join the Lord God's transformation plan. In Shelter City, the 3rd generation of aquatic midgets were all the offspring of their mothers. They worked together with some dwarves who were unwilling to change their appearance or who had just been transported to the city to build the city of Shelter. Using the black oil collected from the deep sea, they continued to develop the dwarven industry, building a composite city that combined the intelligence of both the sea and the surface. Why don't you let this city appear in Ramsey? The industrial level here is even more advanced than that of King's Landing City. The scale of perpetual order can provide more development and more opportunities for such an industrial city. This was Keys's last question to Gaul dazzlingly. The gnome master god's answer was, perhaps I have completed the ecosystem of the aquatic midgets, and they can survive as a species in Ramsey. This sheltered city can provide them and other midgets with a chance to survive one day. But the social system of the aquatic midgets has not been completed yet. When Stim intends to rise, I cannot predict whether his infectious divine domain will once again invade this sheltered city. The young blue dragon immediately gave his own assurance. He won't have that chance. When he finished this sentence, a large number of golden runes appeared out of thin air in the underwater temple. Keyes and Galt dazzlingly had reached an agreement. With this agreement in hand, Keyes returned to King's Landing City with a peace of mind. It was actually not shameful to be a fighter for a god with great divine power. After completing the age-level transformation, Keyes had been swimming in the sea to hunt for prey. This was the first time he had flown into the sky again. However, he did not enjoy this activity for too long. After repeated calculations, the young blue dragon finally confirmed the exact coordinates of the target location and then used the greater transmission spell. The distance of thousands of pails sand was crossed. When he reappeared, Keyes was already high in the sky above King's Landing City. He spread his wings like a large dark cloud, casting a shadow that covered the huge city in an instant. At this time, dawn had just passed. Except for certain groups of people, the people who lived and worked in King's Landing City had actually just woken up from their sleep. At the same time, the steampunk half-lich, who had been carefully monitoring the waves of magic, immediately discovered the huge creature that had been transmitted above their heads. Snade immediately used a spell to send a message to the young blue dragon about the assault that had lasted from last night to this morning. Keyes cast his gaze down from the vault of heaven, overlooking this city that belonged to the scale of perpetual order. He saw the maze that Snade had mentioned. In his magical vision, a bright light of magic was hovering above a street in King's Landing City. A transparent protective cover formed completely by magic covered that street like a giant bowl that had been turned upside down. After a while, there would be a strong flash of light in this maze, which meant that someone was trying to unlock it. In the center of the street, covered by the maze, stood a building that looked like a bastion. Smooth stone walls that were dozens of feet high formed the walls of this building. Some towers were located in each corner of the bastion, and at the top of each tower were several camel people or polar bear people elemental shamans who were constantly throwing fireballs, lightning, and deadly poisonous smoke down below. A large number of monsters that had once wreaked havoc on this land were once again reborn in this maze, like bamboo shoots after a spring rain. They constantly attacked the bastion without fear of death, and it seemed that after each death, the bodies of the monsters would be collected and used again. However, with the support of the elemental shamans on the walls and sufficient defensive machinery, the bastion still withstood the attacks of the monsters that surged like a tide. However, other than that small bastion, there were no other buildings that were higher than the ground in this street. According to the information that Snade had sent, there should have been more than 2,000 criminals from the Yayoi family in this commercial street. But at this time, there was no trace of them. Only a large number of monsters were left. Chapter 833. This place should have been destroyed 10,000 times over. Stim cursed viciously. Because of his extreme rage, the face of the lightning monk that bore his divine power was contorted. I will spread salt all over the ruins of this city. That is if you can escape from here, the emperor who stood beside him said emotionlessly. When he spoke, it was as if there was a council arguing inside his hood. So, great God, please think about what you should do now. Stim glared at the emperor, but he was not stupid enough to retort. They were now grasshoppers on the same rope. Moreover, because of the large number of spirit extinguishers that the Demolic had unleashed in the magic lock, there were many obstacles for him to use his divine spells. Even if he used his full strength, he could only display 50 to 60% of his usual effect. That was why the god of virtual games needed the emperor's help. The magic lock is a large-scale magical barrier that was invented by the god of magic of the elves, Corellon. The reason why it is not widely used, aside from the staggering cost of setting up a magic lock, is more because of its loopholes. No matter what form of magic lock it is, its largest area of influence would not exceed the four-dimensional space. In other words, the magical energy that forms it must have a node, or hub. As long as we find this loophole, we can stop the magical energy of the magic lock from working. In terms of magical attainment, even if Stim was a god, the Emperor's knowledge still far exceeded his. Therefore, it was the Emperor who commanded Stim when it came to deciphering the magic lock. We have tried hundreds of times. We have searched every place in this space that could hide the hub of the magic lock more than once. Only that fortress, because we have been creating an army of monsters to attack, we have neglected to explore it. I am 90% sure that the hub of the magic lock we are looking for should be hidden in that temporary fortress. After hearing the Emperor's analysis, Stim could not help but frown. But what should we do? Should we just teleport into the fortress and look for the possible hub of the magic lock? Then, we would have to spend some effort to decipher it. There's an army stationed there, and those who are involved in the defense of the fortress are all combat elites of powerful races. This god's incarnation had its own concerns. Rushing into the fortress, finding the core of the magic lock, and breaking the spell, each of these 3 steps was not particularly difficult for them, but it was a big problem to do all 3 steps at the same time. After entering the fortress, Stim was of no help at all in finding the magic lock and breaking the spell. He could only rely on the Emperor to complete it alone. After an entire night of trying to break through, they already understood how heaven-defying the strength of this magic lock was. In other words, even for an Emperor, it would take some effort to find the core of the labyrinth or unlock its spell. During that process, the defenders in the fortress would definitely not wait for them to unlock it, and the heavy responsibility of resisting the army's attack would fall entirely on Stim's shoulders. Due to the soul-extinguishing essence that the steampunk Demolic had fused into the lock, Stim couldn't fully utilize his divine power. Although gods were basically unable to be killed by mortals, in the history of the multiverse, there have been many major incidents where mortals had killed the incarnations of gods. Unfortunately, in these major events, the main characters who slaughtered the incarnations of gods were often the elite troops. Stim had no intention of using this incarnation of his to test the strength of King's Landing's army. Seeing the hesitation on the face of the god of virtual games incarnation, the Emperor moved closer to him and whispered, "This is the only way, but I can understand your concerns. As an ally, I have a suggestion from the bottom of my heart." With that, without waiting for Stim to react, the Emperor grasped the hands of the lightning monk incarnation. Surging power roared out of his body, instantly pouring into the incarnation of the god of virtual games. "What have you done?" Stim cried out in surprise. "To make you stronger and break through the shackles of a mortal incarnation so that you can deal with the upcoming mission," the Emperor replied. In the blink of an eye, Stim's incarnation of the lightning monk rapidly expanded like a balloon. His clothes were torn apart by his bulging muscles, and Ramses' human appearance was rapidly deformed. His skin began to thicken and harden, and even marble-like veins appeared. His mouth opened like a tout-yes, and razor-like fangs turned out from his lips. 2 meatballs bulged out from his shoulder blades, and soon, 2 arms broke out of the flesh and blood. Using the incarnation of a god as a base, the Emperor infused it with the soul cores of Chongjiao and the Azura Ghost King, creating his 11th General of Calamity. Although this general would definitely not be as obedient as the others, it should be enough to protect him as an ally for the time being. "It's time for us to move, great god." When the 10-foot-tall Calamity's body had completely taken shape, the Emperor immediately used a superior teleportation spell to appear outside the walls of the fortress guarded by the polar bear men and camel warriors. Large numbers of monsters were attacking the fortress, which was why the defenders did not notice an inconspicuous figure appearing in a shadowy corner of the walls. The reason why they did not directly teleport into the fortress was that this fortress was built by the elemental shamans. When the spellcasters built the fortress, they cast a large number of spells on it, including some defensive spells such as Dimensional Anchor and Banishment Spell. If the Emperor and the others rashly used the superior teleportation spell to break through the fortress, it was likely that they would be temporarily imprisoned or banished. That was why the Emperor had spent so much effort to transform more than 2,000 humans in the Yayoi family mansion into all kinds of monsters and ordered them to launch continuous feints against the fortress. Damn the scale of perpetual order. How much defense equipment and heavy weapons did they bring? They're really rich and powerful, the emperor said in his heart with hatred. 12 years ago, he had lost to such an organization with such a huge amount of resources. It was not easy for him to be resurrected, so he was absolutely furious when he saw his enemy. Fortunately, I was prepared. The characteristics of the two calamity generals, shredding bone and incarnation, are combined. The powerful monster created will definitely be able to break this tortoise shell. The emperor's lips moved, and he quickly recited a series of spells. The monsters that died outside the walls of the fortress were all recovered by the other monsters while they were desperately attacking the fortress. Now, when the emperor began to cast spells, the monsters that had died in anger and pain all opened their eyes. Chapter 834. Burying a conscious undead creature in a non-sacred place. When a lingering decay of the undead creature seeped into the ground, it would cause the entire cemetery, corpses, tombstones, and everything else to gather into a greedy, undead monster. This was the secret method to create a necropolis demon. The amazingly talented emperor had already optimized it many years ago. He found that using the characteristics of shredding bone and incarnation could better enhance the effect of this spell, and even directly create a legendary monster. However, during his previous reign, using two intelligent necropolis generals to exchange for a powerful legendary monster that could only act based on instinct was definitely not a smart approach, and the emperor would certainly not try it. But now, he had to pay the price for his impulsiveness. If I had known that meeting with this Bullsh *T incarnation might lead to the encirclement of the scale of perpetual order, I would never have met him. The emperor cursed fiercely in his heart, but the gestures of his hands and the incantation of his mouth did not stop. He was carefully mobilizing the power of the spell and using precise and subtle operations to change the spell to summon the necropolis demon. A large number of corpses of monsters that had just been transformed and then died in battle gradually merged with the ground and rubble under them. All kinds of corpses were pieced together, reorganized, and connected in an unnatural way. Finally, they were shaped by the power of magic. The emperor had created an active monster grave. It had a certain level of intelligence and was greedy for more corpses. The meaning of its existence was only to increase its size and ability by devouring more corpses. So it got up from the ground and kept moving towards the battlefield. Although it preferred rotten corpses, it did not mind killing life itself, and then throwing it into the filthy soil in its body that could quickly rot the corpses. Compared to the ordinary necropolis demon, the monster created by the emperor by combining the characteristics of two necropolis generals was more like a Tana Reed-Dretch magnified countless times. It had a round belly, two short and thick legs that were slightly pocket-sized compared to its huge body. Two long arms like a gibbon were constantly waving forward, and the sharp claws seemed to want to grab something at every moment. But in fact, its huge body was composed of corpses, rubble, and soil. From a distance, the creature looked like a hulking giant made of mud and stone. However, upon closer inspection, one could distinguish the palms, heads, and other limbs protruding from the dead monster's body. What was even more terrifying was that these things seemed to be endowed with some sort of vitality by magic. Not only did it have a ferocious appearance, but it was also a genuine legendary monster. In particular, with the characteristics of two calamity generals, this undying monster's attacks became even more dangerous and fatal. Hellscream, which was set up on the walls of the bastion, aimed at the monster and fired a barrage of fiery cannonballs at it. The elemental shamans on the top of the towers around the bastion also summoned a lot of lightning bolts and explosive fireballs, hitting it with full force. However, after suffering these attacks, the monster continued to move forward as if nothing had happened. When a monster was less than 100 steps away from the bastion, it suddenly stepped forward and its thick arms fell to the ground in an instant. The earth trembled violently, and the walls of the bastion, which were summoned by magic, were torn with many large and small holes in an instant. Its back shook at a high frequency, and clusters of arrow-like mixtures of corpses and rubble flew out, crossing the city wall and falling into the central square of the bastion. This was the avatar trick that Calamity generals were best at. The mixtures that flew into the bastion might not cause much damage, but they soon stood up again and turned into small giants made of corpses and rubble. They immediately pounced on the surrounding polar bear men and camel warriors. If they were smashed into pieces, it would be fine, but if those warriors were killed, they would immediately be dragged into the monster's body and turned into nourishment. Roar, roar, roar. Feeling the growth of his avatar, the monster standing outside the bastion seemed to laugh heartily and let out a continuous roar. With his long roar, those avatars also twitched and trembled. Bone spurs protruded from the surface of his body and then shot out. In a split second, the bastion was filled with the sound of arrows falling like rain. The sharp bone spikes and arrows formed a curtain of death. Now, hiding in the shadows below the bastion walls, the emperor spoke loudly to the avatar of the god who had the figure of Chong Jiao and 4 arms like an Azura demon king. Enter the bastion. I'll find the core of the lock and crack it, and you'll protect me. With that, the emperor flashed into a fissure and slipped into the bastion. The avatar of the god of virtual games, who was about to transform into Calamity, turned into a puff of smoke and hovered beside the emperor. At the moment, the warriors stationed in the bastion were all caught up in the fierce battle against the tomb monsters and had no time to care about anything else. Therefore, the emperor and Stim's infiltration went very smoothly. After a while, they found the core of the lock, so they set up an alternate space to hide. Beside a pillar at the center of the bastion, the emperor used his palm to place the floating puzzle of 9 palaces on the surface of the pillar. In an instant, light flashed and a door abruptly appeared. There should be a guard inside. Let's see who it is. The emperor extended his hand, and the smoke around his arm entered the door first. Then he followed her in. The avatar of the god of virtual games, who was about to transform into Calamity, was now fighting a steel giant. The iconic huge ebony spikes, its cold luster, and the buzzing circular saw that extended from the mechanical construct reminded the emperor of the storm mech he encountered 12 years ago. You guys play for a while, the emperor thought to himself as he restrained his desire for revenge. Wait until I've unlocked the core of the lock. Just as he was plotting something, an indescribable sense of panic suddenly struck his heart. It was as if he had completely lost something precious, such as the traits of Avatar and Shredder. The tomb is completely dead, the emperor exclaimed. Outside the bastion, a megalosaurus descended from the sky. The lock had also been unlocked by the half-lich Snade because the crisis had been averted. In order not to destroy King's Landing City, Keyes had to shrink his body to less than 1% of his original size. Even so, he was still so huge that it fascinated people. The legendary monster that was 7 or 8 stories tall was only the size of his palm. He did not even use his breath or spells. He only used his dragon claw to turn the tomb into a ball. A turbulent force field surged out, completely annihilating the legendary monster's body on the molecular level and compressing it into a giant ceramic ball. Stim and the so-called Emperor, the young blue dragon, roared into the sky, and all living creatures within hundreds of parsands felt an indescribable sense of panic in their hearts. Keyes raised the ceramic ball in his hand and threw it lightly. The remains of the legendary monster streaked across the sky like a meteor and shot into the ocean north of King's Landing City. Do not disturb the sleeping dragon, for he may awaken at any time and bring you complete and utter destruction. Chapter 835. Keyes returned with unparalleled power and walked unhurriedly towards the bastion that looked like a model to him. His terrifying psionic powers completely overturned reality, and the marble bastion was instantly reduced to stone fragments that rustled and flowed to the ground. Even the ogre warlord Nalu, Every hunchback and bearman warrior within the bastion found themselves in another district of King's Landing in the blink of an eye. With a single thought, Keyes cast a precise group teleportation spell on thousands of people. The Emperor and the god of virtual games, Stim, were no longer afraid to use their greatest imagination to describe the power of the monster that appeared before them. They even suspected that they were being targeted by an ancient evil. Quest was definitely not a god. Both Stim, who had declared himself as a god, and the Emperor, who had done extensive research on the gods, were very sure of it. Otherwise, their understanding of this world would be overturned in an instant. He must be an ancient evil wearing a layer of dragon skin. The Emperor wiped his sweaty forehead, his thoughts running like lightning. Otherwise, what kind of being could stand shoulder to shoulder with a mortal body? No, surpass a god. We must not have anything to do with such a being, or we would definitely be remembered and become a part of their entertainment list. I'm sorry, great god. Your Excellency, Stim, it's better for you to shoulder this calamity. At that thought, the Emperor opened his mouth and chanted a few simple syllables. Stim, who was about to be transformed into a skin bag, paused for a moment as an uncontrollable whisper rang in his ears. It was telling him what he should do now. He raised all four of his arms at once, energy gathering at his fingertips and finally turning into a ball of lightning that shot towards the young blue dragon who was striding towards them. Attacking the blue dragon with a lightning spell, even if it contained divine power, was still a terrible idea. There wasn't even a crackling sound. Like a stream flowing into the sea, the ball of lightning sank into Keyes' cobalt scales. The young blue dragon only grinned and slapped the ground, causing a large cloud of dust to rise. Under the effect of the psionic arcana, the dust instantly changed its nature and turned into tiny metal fragments. A powerful magnetic field was activated, and the metal shards were like bullets, sweeping towards Stim and the king from all directions. Protect me thoroughly, the Emperor said softly. The god of virtual games, who had become a calamity general, couldn't help but take a step forward and stand before the Emperor, spreading his forearms to form a barrier as he faced the storm of steel directly. You bastard, the god's clone shouted angrily. Enduring the pain of being bombarded by the barrage, he immediately wanted to use divine teleportation to leave this place. But in the end, he found that not only Keyes used the dimensional anchor spell on him, but the Emperor also gave the command to fight to the death to this body. There was no other way. All of his divine power could only be used to repair the damage to this body while he charged towards the terrifying Megalosaurus. The extraordinary nature of the gods was largely reflected in their ability to distort reality. As he charged, Stim suddenly conjured a two-handed heavy sword made entirely out of divine power. The weapon was enchanted with a dozen magical effects such as holy damage, extreme sharpness, counter enemy first, and more. There was even a sinister special effect called Dragon Slaying Weapon mixed in. If a normal Megalosaurus were to take such a blow, even the powerful ancient Megalosaurus would probably be severely injured if not killed instantly. And yet, when Stim's slash came into contact with Keyes, it was as if he had struck a shadow. He had entered a quantum state. It went straight through the scales, and, in the end, the heavy blow landed completely on the ground. If you want to fight, let's fight. The young blue dragon raised his head and roared, the tip of his claws gripping the ground that had thousands of cracks, and actually mending the ground in an instant. At the same time, Stim, whose feet had sunk into the ground due to his own attack, was injured once again. Because Keyes' strength was too terrifying, the ground that was mended became as hard as diamond under the heavy pressure, and the god of virtual games was squashed into a pile of meat paste from his feet down. He fell to the ground involuntarily. Fortunately, his Azura form had 4 arms, and Stim quickly retreated while sticking close to the ground like a spider. It was also fortunate that he had sharp reflexes, and that was why he was not hit by Keyes' follow-up blow. Even so, Keyes' terrifying combat ability to severely injure a god's clone in a single exchange still made Stim, who was facing this horror directly, and the Emperor who was looking at it all feel nervous. Why are you running? Keys roared. The wings that were folded behind his back suddenly spread open, and the wings that could cover several streets shone with a blinding light. After the adaptive evolution, the blazing crystal, obtained from the Grand Dimensional Laboratory, had formed a thin layer of crystal on his wings. Before diving down from the sky, Keys had already absorbed a large amount of energy from the morning sun, and now this energy was released as pure light. Not only did the light have the characteristics of particles, but it also had the characteristics of waves, and the areas it shone on all shook violently. The Emperor's body that had been reshaped with the help of Calamity's soul was vaporized in the blink of an eye. Stim's clone was in a better condition, but only by a little. Although his body did not seem to be injured on the surface, with large patches of blue veins popping out, the organs inside his body were almost all shattered into pieces. Sharp claws carrying thunderbolts and lightning fell from the sky, nailing Stim's clone to the ground. The young blue dragon suddenly switched to the Ramsey language and said word by word, "God who can't even withstand a single blow, Stim, 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 Stim." All of King's Landing had heard his declaration, and it wouldn't be long before the news of this god's miserable defeat spread throughout Ramsey. Failure was an unspeakable secret for most of the gods, and widespread failure was a fatal wound for them. As long as they still needed to spread their faith, this kind of failure would definitely have an extremely negative impact on their potential believers. Except for those fanatics who made faith their way of life and the goal they pursued in life, most believers had a utilitarian mentality when it came to giving up their faith. If a god kept failing, believers would feel that they could not protect themselves, and thus would not be willing to give up their faith. Stim was both shocked and angry. Unfortunately, before he could finish his sentence, the combined force field spread through his clone through Keys's fingertips. On a molecular level, the clone was annihilated by the young blue dragon into a pile of ashes. Chapter 836. A man was running, crashing through a thin wall of bark and leaves. Deep in the wood there were primitive sounds everywhere. The canopy of the trees shook. The man was carrying something heavy, and though he could not see the sun, he was sweating all over. He followed the path as far as he could. It was not until just before dark that he found his mark. He followed the path of the firebrand gatherers to a hollow, surrounded by the roots of plants and the stone-studded earth. The thicket was thinning. The mud was trampled hard and showed traces of scorch. He unfolded his bundle and his blanket, took out his few books and clothes, and put a heavy, tightly wrapped object on the centipede-infested earth. It was very cold in the wood, and he made a fire. Then the darkness shut him out, but he kept looking into the shadows, as if waiting for something to appear. There was movement in the vicinity. There was a continuous series of small noises, like the cries of nocturnal birds or the panting and growling of hidden predators. He was very alert. He carried a gun and a long sword. Even in his sleep, he held one or the other in his hand. He watched the time pass by in the light of the fire, sleeping fitfully and at short intervals. Every time he woke up, he gasped for breath, as if he had just emerged from the water. He had just suffered a heavy blow, and his face was full of grief and anger. "I will come back," he said. He did not notice the dawn until he could see clearly at the edge of the clearing. He moved stiffly, like a dummy made of twigs, like the cold damp of the night. He chewed his jerky, listened to the noise of the jungle, and paced back and forth in the low mud. At last he heard a voice, and leaning against the edge of the slope, he looked between the trunks of the trees. A man was coming up the path, strewn with leaves and debris. He watched the man, holding his gun tight in his hand. When the man came into the thicker light, he saw his face and lowered his gun. "Here," he shouted. The man stopped dully, looking for his position. He raised his hand and stretched it out over the edge of the hole. It was a tall man, whose hooded robe was even less suited to the forest than his own. The man walked into the depression and stood in front of him. He smiled and said, "Mr. Mataro, this is the first time we meet. Please take care of me." Seeing the other party take off his hood, revealing the lightning monk's iconic bald skull with a large circuit diagram tattoo. Mataro finally felt relieved. As the backbone of the Barbers, before the Scales of Eternity army cleaned up the Yayoi family's mansion, he suddenly received a personal note from the new leader. After receiving the terrible news, he immediately escaped from his family's mansion alone through a secret passage. For one day and one night, he was as anxious as a stray dog. He only had a limited amount of wealth on him, and all of it was used to pay the merchants who were involved in alcohol smuggling in King's Landing City for using their channels to leave the city. After leaving the city, he immediately took a detour to Razor Trail and entered the boundless forest. He had only managed to run out of Monarch's Descent City's sphere of influence in slightly more than a day's time, arriving near the ruins of Jadewood City, which was later destroyed due to the Emperor's summoning of the Earth God. According to the leader, there would be a lightning monk here to receive him. However, he still had to pay a considerable commission. "The thing you want is here," Mataro said to the lightning monk as he swept away a pile of leaves used as cover, kicked away a piece of bark, and pointed at the wooden carving that he had dug to hide. At first glance, this wooden carving looked like a crude carving that was directly dug out of dead wood. It was also covered with despicable colors that resembled children's graffiti, and its value was probably not too high. But in reality, it was the opposite. This wooden carving was a very powerful magic item, and it did not emit any magic waves. This is an underwater agarwood carving. Agarwood is also known as the Requiem wood, and it can house powerful souls. Moreover, the clay colors were painted with a mixture of blood and paint. There are 99 kinds of paint on this wooden carving. In other words, it has been sacrificed by 99 different lives. This wooden carving can directly be used as a phylactery for a lich, and even a great lich can use it. Hearing Mataro's self-praising tone, Lightning Monk nodded his head and bent down to lift the wooden carving out of the pit. Because of the hard texture, this wooden carving was much heavier than it looked. It is indeed a good thing, but you may have made a mistake. Holding the wooden carving under his left arm, the Lightning Monk stretched out a finger. This wooden carving has only sacrificed 99 lives. There is still one more. A red lightning bolt shot out from the Lightning Monk's fingertips and entered Mataro's chest. The Japanese merchant, a senior member of the Barber organization, was blown into a mist of blood in an instant. The Lightning Monk threw the wooden carving high, and the flesh fragments flew straight to the carving like young swallows returning to their nest. Then, under the effect of a spell set in advance, the flesh fragments seemed to be re-glued with adhesive and once again molded into a naked human figure. Who, landing on the ground, the Emperor, who had once again obtained a new body, exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. "Long time no see, great God. We meet again." The Lightning Monk nodded. But suddenly, a noose woven from divine power flew out of his hand and wrapped around the Emperor's neck. "I'm sorry, I chose to believe you the last time we met, but unfortunately, I lost an avatar. So before this meeting, I've already thought it through. I'm in charge, not you." As he spoke, the Lightning Monk, or to be more precise, the last avatar of the god of virtual games, Stim, pulled the noose in his hand and disappeared with the Emperor. In the blink of an eye, the god brought the Emperor across the barrier of space and appeared in a magnificent temple. He returned directly from the Ramsey continent to Dwarf Island. After all, after witnessing the terrifying power of the Megalosaurus, his sense of security had dropped to the lowest point. If it wasn't for the fact that he wanted to bring the Emperor back, he would never have left his last incarnation in Ramsey for so long. Holding the noose in his hand and pulling the Emperor, who was tied up like a dumpling, the god walked step by step to the high platform in the middle of the temple. He sat on his opal throne and picked up a brass bell from the armrest of the throne. Along with the tinkling of bells, priests wearing dark blue clergy robes walked in from the various entrances of the shrine one after another. "I declare," Stim said softly, but his voice was deafening in the ears of every priest. "From now on, the church and the entire territory of Dwarf Island shall enter a state of war readiness. Ye shall immediately take over the steam hall. No matter what protests the followers of the dwarf god may have, ye only need to bring them before me. Chapter 837. The sailors scanned the horizon and oiled the cannons from time to time. This was a long and narrow strait. There were hundreds of small islands and trading towns that could not be clearly seen on nautical charts. On the other side of the strait, the commercial needs of King's Landing City were like a bottomless pit. There was an endless supply of ships. Thus, there was a period of time when the pirates of Joms often appeared here, doing business without capital. The sky was filled with flying machines. There were single-person propeller-driven flying machines that looked like bees circling a beehive. There were oddly shaped cargo airships that transported heavy goods between ships. There were unique single-person balloons with pendulum-like seats hanging from them. There were also combat airships a little further away. They were the oval-shaped flying cannons. The most eye-catching one was the huge flagship of the Leviathan, the Nefermendis. A huge fleet of more than 50 ships, coupled with the flying machines that blotted out the sky. Any large sea beast or pirate with a bit of rationality would choose to temporarily avoid them. Only a few schools of fish chased after them, wantonly enjoying the organic bait that was poured into the sea through the sewage holes. As the ships split the waves, white foam gathered on the surface of the sea, like a pot of boiling soup. Compared to the calm of the fleet's voyage, there was a different scene on the sea. Hundreds of perescents. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the surface of the sea. A curtain of rain hit the small ship, pouring onto the thick oak deck. The sea was turbulent, and the small ship was in danger of being swallowed. It shook on the surface of the sea, rising and falling with the waves. A man stuck to the rigging, tried to raise the sails, and regain some control of the ship. He was completely soaked. His long black hair was wrapped around his head, and the water on his hair flowed down his bare chest. The wet and heavy pants made it difficult for him to maintain his balance. But in the end, he managed to hold the sails in place. He could finally breathe a sigh of relief. As the first mate, he had warned his boss before they set off that such a situation could happen at sea, so they needed a new crew. But Naman had insisted that a dozen old pirates from Joms would be enough to handle everything. They might even be able to find other companions during the voyage. What a terrible idea. The first mate complained his heart. He clung to the mast and climbed down. The slightest mistake would have thrown him overboard with his life hanging in the balance. The storm hit him in the face, tearing at his skin and pants. He stood on the deck, clinging to the mast for support. At the stern of the ship, he could see Captain Naman playing a game with the rudder. The 6-foot-tall man was grinning. The first mate thought gloomily, "That's right, he wants to kill himself just like that." Suddenly, the ship tilted to one side. The first mate held on to the mast tightly, like a drowning man holding on to a precious life-saving straw. Naman, who was fiddling with the wheel, was thrown to the side of the ship. Fortunately, the lifeline tied to his waist caught him. The first mate didn't even dare to breathe loudly as he stared at the captain who was crawling on the deck. But Naman did not seem to care. He managed to turn over and return to the rudder. "Don't worry," yelled Narman at the top of his voice. Strangely enough, even though the waves were surging, his voice was clearly heard by every sailor on the Ghost-Faced Fish. Even those who were still below deck were no exception. "Our new ship will never capsize. You're all lucky. Below deck, listen up. Take care of those little cuties for me." By little cuties, he meant the military horses that were kept on the lower deck. They were all placed in large wooden cages. The cages were tied with ropes and hung from the top of the deck without touching the ground. That way, the horses would suffer less in the cages, and they would be less likely to fall ill from the tossing of the waves. They would be of great use in the near future. The Ghost-Faced Fish sailed northwestward through the storm for a whole night. At last, it was out of the sea. The sun had not yet risen. In the dim light of dawn, rocks rose from the water below. It was difficult to judge the size and distance of the land. The rocks, which were not very large, were scattered like the backs of whales. There were no birds or animals on them, only brown stones and green bushes. The ghost-faced fish sailed into a lagoon. The details of the sea became clear. The dark blue sea surface that was originally wrinkled gradually showed the shape of waves. The foam and water flow could also be distinguished. Under the water, there were black reefs and colorful kelp groups. "We will reach the shore in an hourglass." Narman's voice rang out again in the ears of every sailor. The captain's words were proved correct. After an hourglass of sailing, the ship passed between the lagoons. An island appeared in front of the ghost-faced fish. It was located in the cold northern ocean, but it was lush and full of vitality. The island was about 300 leagues long and 100 wide. Where the ship was about to reach the shore, the terrain was rugged and covered with dull gray mountains and hills. Clearly, it was not a suitable place for landing. The gnomes lived to the west of the mountain range. The coastline, there is a natural ice-free harbor. All the ships that trade with the gnomes will dock at those places. Naman was standing on the head of a ferocious demon statue at the bow of the ship. He was giving an impassioned speech in an impassioned voice. The target of his speech was the dozen or so crew members who were busy dragging the sick military horses out of the cabin after the voyage. For us Jom's heroes, it doesn't matter where we go ashore. We don't know how to do business. If we want something, we have to snatch it ourselves. After resting for 2 hourglasses, the war horses finally regained their strength. The pirates of Jom's rode on them and set off. They left the ghost-faced fish at the shore. The first mate wanted to leave 2 people to watch the ship, but Narman insisted on taking all the sailors with him. "Don't worry. You don't know what the ship can do. We just have to snatch it, and there will be people who will help us." Unable to dissuade the captain, the first mate could only keep quiet. A dozen or more of them, mounted on more than 30 horses, both rotated and equipped for baggage, set out swiftly from the coast. Before they set sail from King's Landing, Narman had studied the geography of Dwarf Island. He knew that there were a few small paths in the mountain range. It was not suitable for an army to pass through, but it was not a problem for a dozen or so people. As long as they passed through these small paths, they would reach the heart of the only city on Dwarf Island. Then, they could carry out their plan. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.